Okay, it looks like I'm live now, so that's exciting. I thought it would be pertinent today to look at this subject matter again because I noticed as I was looking through my YouTube analytics this morning that quite a number of women had been, well, I assume women, maybe it's not women, but I noticed that my video from years ago on butch oppression and femme privilege had been receiving some views. And I thought about where I was at the time with my analysis and kind of some of the motivations for why I made that video in the first place. And also just looking at myself in the video, you know, and thinking about my own progress in terms of my relationship with trying to work through femininity in myself. I thought it would be pertinent to just look at it again and kind of talk about it in with a little bit more perspective, because I am of the opinion that how we are acting in the world, it will reflect how our messages come across. At that time, I was very feminine in appearance and in behavior, and I still notice a lot of feminine behavioral issues that I have. I also still practice femininity to an extent that is something that I just need to work on, like a lot of us do. But it often comes into my life when I'm feeling vulnerable, mainly. And as it so happens, like that has been recently. So I think this is a good subject to just look at from that perspective as well, because understanding what these things mean, or the meaning behind why we are the way we are, why we choose the things we choose and do the things we do, is so important. And yeah. So at that time, a few years ago, as I said, I was very feminine in my appearance. And I had been interested in the subject matter for a long time before then, but I hadn't really worked out so much completely trying to defeminize myself or trying to like cultivate a dyke appearance, while I think I was out, I wasn't like visible in the way that I later chose to become. And part of that was just not really feeling comfortable with myself and not really feeling motivated too. I've never felt like I could fit in anywhere. So I think part of it was just like not wanting to completely leap. Also, I'd had many experiences in the past where I had attempted to defeminize my appearance and had been met with a lot of hostility. And I think that too kind of helped feed some of the fears. And I hear this so often when women talk about like not wanting to cut their hair or not wanting to stop doing certain things. It's all related to fear and vulnerability and like feeling that we would be receiving essentially the things that are a massive part of butch oppression. Which is always interesting to me that like we can see that other women go through this, but yet not have a ethic around how to combat it. So for me, what really kind of shifted this whole energy in my life and this kind of dragging my feet about certain things was actually falling in love with a woman who was really, stop, ooh, say very visible, you know, and I think that kind of confronted me with how I wasn't living up to and measuring up to my own standards as a person. And, you know, I also saw how much her life was impacted by the othering that happens to women who don't do femininity and aren't feminine. And it's just, I felt like I had a responsibility, I guess, in a way that I hadn't felt before. So that's kind of what inspired me more than anything else. I felt like I need to, you know, measure up more. And so like that challenge to myself and my own like inability to be that. Like I really saw, I guess, the hollowness of how I was speaking versus how I was living. Okay. And so when I look at that video, even though it kind of came out around that time period, like I just can't take the woman in it as seriously as I can take the woman speaking now seriously, just because, you know, once you experience some of what we're going to be talking about today, like for yourself and not just like the specter of it. Ow! Ow! Oh! Ooh, why are you being nasty? Come here. Ugh. Oh, I thought you were going to be chill today. I thought we were going to be chill. Ow. He like dug his freaking claw into my leg and it's still stinging. Ugh, he's so bad. Anyway, where was I? Once you've experienced some of what I'm going to talk about, like it's very eye-opening in another way. And I think most women subconsciously have a fear about what would happen if they weren't treated like girls anymore, or like how feminine women get treated, which is generally with a level of deference that as a culture we don't really acknowledge. But this comes at the expense of butches and also visible dykes. Because the thing about these subject matters, butch and femme as concepts, and why I like this book that I'm going to read from so much, is that it details more of the perspective that it's not about roles as such, and they divorce kind of these concepts from that. Although they talk about it, they also understand that like these things impact even when you're dealing with like interactions amongst women based on like grades of femininity and that kind of thing, and how women kind of how we establish hierarchies as a people. So if you want to like understand that and understand kind of the challenges to a lot of the hierarchies around the concept of womanhood and the concept of femininity, then I think like this is work for you to visit. You know, I also think there's just so much that in the video I did years ago, I only understood intellectually. So one thing that's happened to me more now that I kind of see and have mirrored back to me and my younger self is the level of teasing that feminine women do when they read you as like visibly dykey or like less feminine. It's a way of establishing dominance a lot of the time around who's more of a woman. And it's kind of alienating. So I've gone through a lot of that. I've also gone around through a lot of like being told that I can't speak to a lot of experiences that I have so much understanding of, because I don't currently practice femininity in the same ways, which has been like really mind fucking blowing. Like, especially given how like hard femme I've been in the past. So like that's an interesting aspect of it. Also had more like hostility from males in public. One thing that's interesting is that even though I'm like more visibly like dykey in my day-to-day life as I like go out and run my errands and things like that, men still like invade my personal space and do all kinds of like creepy shit when I'm in public. That, you know, I think that is part of like the difference too, although not always, but there's just a lot of things that I've seen and experienced now, and also just felt since I kind of decided to become more militant about these matters, that has totally alienated me from a lot of other women. So anyway, and I totally understand like a lot of the anxiety I think that many people feel around the identity of women, like specifically female people, because women don't all get treated the same. And what a woman is in this culture is often very limited in scope. And I think part of what women like me are meant to do is to expand that and to make it like a bigger category. But it's challenging. And it's also confusing. And there's so many like trendy concepts now that you could like just opt out altogether. And then it's alien to reality, and it's alien to like, you know, our actual differences and the things that connect us all. So it's all really, it's really confusing and challenging. But I have to say that it's made me more of a compassionate person. It's made me see more of my hardness, more of my just inability to access myself in a lot of ways. Taking off like the artifice of womanhood and just like existing is so different. It's so different. And until you do it, it's just, you don't understand it the same ways. And so at the time that I did that video, like I said, I was processing a lot of this stuff and coming to conclusions and trying to become less feminine. But like once I really made the leap, I was just like, okay, you got to get rid of all of this crap. There's just a whole other layer of understanding. And interestingly enough, I would suggest that those of you who haven't watched it, go watch the interview I did this summer with the 2 Korean feminists we talked specifically about how femininity and like our choice to not engage in it separated us from other women. And specifically, Ara had talked about how she felt when she had no hair compared to like going out and just having a visceral feeling of the difference and between her and other women that was like so apparent and obvious. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. I am going to read to you today, like I said in the description, from Dykes-Loving-Dykes, Dykes Separatist Politics for Lesbians Only. I want to read chapter 4. It's about 50 pages though, so I don't know if I'm going to totally be able to do it because that's a lot of reading. That being said, I do think that this subject matter is something that should be up and preserved because it's hard to get women to like read this work. I've noticed, even though it's like all available online. Women just don't want to stop and read a lot of the time. And I really think that a lot of things that we understand but don't have words for are contained in this book. And that's so valuable. So yeah. Ugh. I'm gonna just mess around here for a second. Okay. There we go. All right. So strap yourself in and prepare to listen to the chapter 4, Butch Hatred is Lesbian Hatred. Part 1, Introduction. We originally wrote this chapter as 2 articles in order to counter the increasing glorification of femininity and role-playing in most lesbian publications and among individual lesbians. This reactionary trend is part of the growing acceptance of heterosexist values amongst lesbians in all the countries we have information about. We have to fight it, because ignoring it means contributing to it. We use the term butch oppression and femme privilege for what many lesbians call roles and role-playing. Roles implies that butches and femmes have equal power, or that only lesbians who define themselves as butch or femme are in roles. But this is a political issue of power inequality, and is as serious and real as any other inequality that Dykes work to change. Our language should name the real core of the issue. Butch oppression makes it clear that femmes have the power. When we use the word roles, we mean the basic core identities of butch and femme that all lesbians have. We say role-playing to mean deliberate role-playing, as well as all the ways femmes maintain power over butches, including sexual and social behavior, political beliefs, appearance, self-image, and manner. Butch and femme are only 2 facets of our lesbian identities. They're only one set of roles we're in. Some others include non-mother and mother, never het and ex-het, and old dyke and women's liberation movement lesbian. So this was published in the early 90s. I want to stop there and say that. So what I see now talked about a lot that I want to address, and I forgot to say at the intro of this, is that I see a lot of discussion nowadays about masculine of center privilege. So for one, defining certain characteristics that women have as masculine is really troubling for a lot of reasons. But it's also really what I see as a reversal of the reality, because as I said, being visible and being visible means taking on the hatred of the collective. Whereas if you're passing, you don't do that. So specifically what women have often referred to as mask of center privilege has been things around, well, the only thing that I've found that's in any way compelling is the idea that men more freely will share information or talk about certain subjects with women who they perceive as masculine. But apart from that, I've not been able to find anything that's as compelling. And, while that can be an advantage, I do think that there are other disadvantages that are things that really need to be addressed. And when we talk about that, it really obscures a lot of what's actually going on in terms of sex and gender and that kind of thing. Okay. So let's see. We want to make it clear that we're against role-playing. Acknowledging butch existence and oppression does not mean supporting role-playing. To think that it does is like saying acknowledging lesbian existence supports stereotypes about lesbians. When we talk about all lesbians being butch or femme, we're using these definitions to make it possible for butch oppression to be fought. Just as it's impossible to fight classism if some lesbians claim to be class-free, it's impossible to end role-playing as long as some lesbians deny that they are in roles. Otherwise, it's always someone else's problem. However, butch and femme roles among lesbians are far more complex than class. The terms are loaded, the definitions are contradictory, and more than any other issue among lesbians, the thought of it brings up intense lesbian hatred. To admit your role in a responsible way means declaring your commitment to strong queer identity, which takes a lot of courage. Unfortunately, most lesbians who openly define themselves as femme, and to a lesser extent butch, aren't doing it responsibly or even accurately. They're just glorifying role-playing as sexy and fun. But role-playing, including the intense versions played by lesbians who deny they play roles, is hurtful and damaging to lesbians individually and as communities. The male origin of femininity is clear. We agree with the basic feminist writings of the early 70s that rejected all forms of femininity. Men demand that females caricature ourselves for men's benefit. Identifying and rejecting that crap is the way to find our true, innate female selves. Even non-lesbian feminists worked on these politics and consciousness-raising groups in the past. Yet many lesbians, including those who consider themselves radical, still admire and emulate that male facade. They've embraced femininity, calling it the core of their identities, even though femininity is so clearly a self-absorbed, narcissistic, unnatural state. These lesbians believe that it's true femaleness, and so they set up femness as the acceptable norm for lesbians. Besides the obvious signs of femininity in clothes, makeup, and mannerisms, and in articles glorifying femininity in lesbian and feminist publications, there are also subtle undercurrents of feminization among lesbians. In this chapter, we confront both the obvious and the subtle. Looking past the tangle of lies we're taught from the moment we're born means facing the fact of being queer in a whole new way, a reality that's far removed from the world of normal het women. Butch oppression is a difficult issue to deal with because there are so many conflicting definitions of what it is to be femme or butch. Butch lesbians are those who, as girls, rejected feminization and refused to play the role designed by men for women. Femme lesbians are those who accepted the feminine role to various degrees as girls. There are differences among femmes. At one end of the scale, the extremely feminine femmes we call queens, and this is another reason why I hate being called a queen, internalize male ideas of womanhood, which requires continually viewing oneself as if through men's minds until men's ideals feel like one's own. At the other end, Dyke-identified femmes are repulsed by most aspects of femininity. Femmes lesbianism is obviously a major resistance against male values and male appropriation of females. But our basic femininity and recognition by the het world as women remains. Since we're two femmes and one butch, meaning who's writing this book, we generally use the term we when writing about both groups. We can choose to grow less feminine in thought, action, manner, looks, and clothes. However, nothing can change the fact that femmes grew up feeling accepted as real girls and real women. And so we're spared the agony, punishment, abuse, and self-doubt of being ostracized as abnormal. Most likely the reason girls become feminine is the same reason lesbians choose to remain feminine, go back to being more feminine, or pressure other lesbians to become feminine. That is, so they can fit in, feel acceptable, and not have to think of themselves as different. Most butches who acknowledge being butch clearly remember hating and resisting femininity when we were little girls. A butch's resistance brings down extreme punishment. She's described as abnormal, queer, a woman who wants to be a man. She's often beaten, raped, institutionalized, psychiatrically tortured, including being subjected to electroshock, drugs, and psychosurgery, and or disowned by her family for not acting like a woman. Her resistance does not ever win her the privileges that men keep for themselves, because men know she's indeed a female and a most rebellious one. She's made an example of for all females contemplating resistance. She has stepped out of her proper place and gotten above herself. Butch oppression originates with men saying, in effect, this is how patriarchy punishes resistors. So, just going to stop there and kind of sit with that for a second. I think this is something that we all intuitively know. And it's one of those things that, until it's named, we don't really have a language for. But when I read that, I had this instinctual acknowledgement that some of what my fear in not being feminine was totally related to that. And seeing how, even as little girls, these messages were absorbed very easily and subconsciously. Also, my feet are cold, so I'm going to put on my little booties. It's raining. So where was I? Many femmes, especially separatists, are strongly Dyke identified and genuinely want all Dykes to have equal loving friendships and relationships. Adoration of femininity is no more acceptable to Dyke identified femmes than it is to aware butches. And that's why we, Linda and Rustin, as femme Dykes, are willing to fight femme privilege as butch Dykes are. Becoming aware for the first time that you're in a position of privilege can be jarring. But that hasn't stopped many femmes from taking that new awareness as a chance to strengthen our Dyke identities and work towards stronger Dyke communities. For most Dykes, the very mention of butch and femme is upsetting because it seems to prove male lies about us. One of the most common stereotypes of lesbians is that we quote-unquote play roles. Therefore, many lesbians insist roles don't exist, or that only the most unfeminist, uneducated, and male-identified lesbians play roles. Roles are supposed to be a thing of our sleazy and perverted past that feminism cured. These condescending, lesbian-hating politics discredit and malign anyone who dares to try sorting out the complex truth. More recently, there's been a glorification of role-playing. Some newer lesbians think of roles as a trendy game, imitating mainstream hets' reactionary return to the 1950s nostalgia with 1950s racism, queer bashing, and stagnation. Some lesbians we've known who were unconsciously playing the femme role began to be conscious and deliberate about it when they realized it could increase their privilege. So roles are either considered a reactionary topic we should avoid, or the key to the hottest lesbian sex, especially if played in an S&M setting. Also, there are a lot of femmes who think it's fun to play at being butch, the same way some class-privileged lesbians make a game of downward mobility. Some of these femmes are the most vocal about being butch, which adds to the general confusion about roles. All these misconceptions make it very hard to even begin dealing with roles in a responsible political way. But it's essential to do it. The issue of butch oppression is as complex as any other political issue that involves hierarchies amongst lesbians. As with any other inequality, ignoring it does not make the problem go away. It persists, affecting how each of us thinks and feels about herself and other Dykes. It affects our political work, our friendships, and our interactions with lovers. Exploring the truth about dyke identity, including butch identity, is the only way to learn to truly value and love each other and ourselves as dykes. Dykes who want to deal with roles aren't responsible for roles existing. We're just describing them and trying to fight injustice. We don't want lesbians to feel shame, guilt, fear, embarrassment, or to take offense. We're writing to free dykes from those feelings. Nor are we confirming male and het lies about lesbians. We're trying to make sense of a confusing situation that causes pain and oppression for butch dykes, and we're taking immense risks in doing it. Dealing with any issue of inequality is hard and can be painful. No matter how unjust, the status quo of injustice is familiar and can seem safer. But the damage is severe. While the gains from fighting butch oppression mean happier, safer, stronger lesbian communities for all of us. Some of the oppressive behavior we describe may be similar to something you find yourself doing. If you realize that it's just a way you learn to act and identify with and isn't who you are deep down inside, otherwise you wouldn't be a dyke, then it's possible to stop being oppressive without feeling personally threatened. And if you sincerely care about the dykes you're oppressing and causing pain, it's possible to let go of old ways of behaving and change without feeling resentful or bad. Every dyke we know, both femme and butch, who's had the guts to bring up butch oppression and femme privilege, has been attacked to her face and in the lesbian press, and has been subjected to ridicule, condescension, slander, social exclusion, and loss of friendships, all in an effort to suppress the truth. Obviously, we care very much about this issue and are deeply convinced of the accuracy of our understanding, if we're prepared to risk this sort of reaction. Femmes have usually been the most insulting, but because this issue threatens their power over butches, those who fear loss of privilege usually become enraged. Femmes who deny that roles exist are actually saying butches don't exist. Butch oppression is denied by most lesbians, the way lesbian oppression is denied by most het women. Some butches also deny that roles exist or that butches are oppressed because for butches, thinking about it brings pain, self-hatred, and fear of exposure to the surface, and because exploring butch oppression can bring retribution from femme lovers and friends. Coming out as butch is as terrifying and difficult as coming out as a lesbian or a separatist without support. The reactions are similar to what happens when someone brings up class in a group for the first time. She usually meets with angry resistance, denial, hostile jokes, unfair accusations, and ostracism by the privileged, which crushes opportunities for major positive changes in how we think of ourselves and each other. This destroys our chances for personal happiness and dyke unity. Such reactions focus sympathy on the outraged femme, when it's the butch who needs support. When roles are acknowledged by radical feminist lesbians, they usually assume that only butches play roles. Femmes aren't considered femme, but are thought of as just ordinary lesbians, because we merge into the mainstream concept of normality. Being more feminine makes us more like females are meant to be in a male-run world. These male standards have been taken for granted for so long, they're usually assumed to be quote-unquote natural. If we realize that femininity confers privilege and therefore power, and not nurturance, fragility, softness, and warmth, we won't fall for feminine games. If we realize that resistance to femininity makes openness, honest directness, a sense of realness, emotional intensity, passion, and lesbian loyalty more possible, we can build more of those qualities in ourselves and in our communities. If we don't reject femininity and the lesbian-hating, self-hating politics it reflects, we'll never have fair and equal personal or political relationships, because we won't be loving and valuing each other as lesbians. Discussions about lesbian ethics will remain an abstract fantasy, as long as love and friendship are based on unethical game playing, manipulation, and objectification. Butches as scapegoats. Butches have kept lesbianism alive and visible over the centuries and should be an inspiration to us all. Butches who are out in times and places where females are openly owned by fathers or husbands are extremely brave. They are the first to be attacked or persecuted, imprisoned, and killed during the times of female and lesbian repression. Butch oppression is simply a more extreme version of how all lesbians are treated by a heterosexist world. Men and het women often use the term butch interchangeably with lesbian. Men often use the term Men and het women scapegoat lesbians for male crimes. Lesbians are portrayed as girl molesters when it's men who are the rapists, and when lesbians ourselves are among the many girl victims of rape by male relatives and strangers. Men have succeeded in diverting attention away from their own violence, teaching women to displace their real rage and fear of men onto lesbians. Scapegoating lesbians enables the het woman who shrinks in revulsion from a dyke on the bus or who shouts insults at a dyke at work to live with, look after, and defend a man who beats her and rapes her daughters. No female can afford to be innocent about men's deadly games. This scapegoating is central to lesbian oppression. It's become clear only recently that most females are victims of family rape, making it obvious that most males are rapists. I mean, this book goes there. The enormity of this terrorization is why males find it necessary to divert attention elsewhere in order to maintain het women's devotion. Butches personify lesbianism, so the most rage and fear is directed at us. Butches are portrayed by hets and femme lesbians as hardened abusers of females, when it's men who are callously genocidal, and when butches ourselves are prime targets of male violence, as well as abuse from het women and femmes. The existence of roles has been so distorted and lied about by hets, and butch identity is so deeply linked with dyke identity and queer oppression that just mentioning the issue often calls forth denial, raw pain, anger, and confusion among longtime dykes. It also calls forth a stream of anti-butch stereotypes from reactionary ex-het femmes who haven't rid themselves of the lesbophobia of their het years. Butches have the right to come out as butch, yet when we do, reactions are often identical to how hets react to any lesbian coming out. In spite of all the pressure, there have always been dykes who identify as butch, as well as butches who won't, just as there are lesbians who are clearly out and others who prefer to be called women or women with a Y. A lesbian-focused analysis of butch oppression has to be based on what we know about heterosexism and lesbian hatred. Who first accused lesbians, especially butches, of being quote-unquote like men? Who first accused lesbians of imitating heterosexual couples? Who is the most invested in destroying our self-esteem and making us appear repulsive to ourselves and others? Who is most invested in discouraging girls from resisting femininity and heterosexuality? Who uses lesbians, especially butches, as scapegoats? We know men's lies, and we know we can extricate ourselves from yet another network of lies that damages us at the very core of our dyke identities and at the heart of our relationships with each other. Butches are not like men. Lesbians are not the same as het couples. Analyzing roles among lesbians really means analyzing femme privilege, butch oppressions, and the heterosexual hierarchy that exists among lesbians. Instead of assuming that butches are in a role while femmes are just quote-unquote being themselves, we need to recognize that it's femmes who have accepted the artificialities of a role, while butches have resisted accepting those artificialities. Het women consider themselves to be the norm of female reality, just as femmes consider femininity the standard by which all lesbians should be measured. This means that many, perhaps most femmes, don't even consider themselves to be femme. They think of themselves simply as women, women with a Y, or for the most radical, lesbians or dykes. That's similar to how het women don't think of themselves as feminine women or het women, but simply as women. It's left to us as lesbians to say that het women don't represent us all, that they aren't the females, but are just one kind of female. Otherwise, we end up accepting their implicit definition of us as non-female. In the same way, we need to assert that femmes don't represent lesbianism or the ideal lesbian. We've been bombarded with feminine standards since we were born. So many butches also believe the propaganda that feminist is the normal way to be. This is similar to how the cultures of the class privileged can seem more real and even cozily familiar to poor and working class dykes than our own cultures because of media propaganda. Take a sip of water. And tea. Butch oppression is so ignored that most lesbians insist on simple definitions if anyone dares to bring up the subject. When easy explanations aren't possible, they conclude that the issue isn't real. After all, why should most femmes care when they're not the ones being hurt? Denying the reality of butch oppression is like denying any inequality. Denial ensures the continuation of that oppression. Butch oppression isn't even given a validity as a political issue. Even otherwise, radical lesbians make jokes about butches and put us down in a way that they never would do with other oppressed groups. Although some lesbians are opposed to classism being discussed and fought, for instance, at least there's recognition that classism exists in patriarchy and also among lesbians. Often femmes and even some butches say that butches are not only not oppressed, but that we're oppressive to femmes. Old myths die hard, especially when the male and het world all around us constantly pressures us to believe them. The fact is that more femmes fit negative butch stereotypes, including being quote-unquote male-identified and quote-unquote like men, than butches do. Femmes who single out butches in this way are acting like the men and het women who say that lesbians are as cruel and horrible as men. Femmes may find this a terrible thing to say, but how do they think butches feel to be told such things about ourselves? We should know by now that believing stereotypes distorts our perceptions. For example, a femme who isn't expressive or talkative may be perceived as shy and vulnerable, while a quiet butch may be called sullen, cold, and aloof. A femme who shouts in anger may be perceived as strong and having a right to her feelings, while a butch raising her voice in anger is likely to be perceived as violent and domineering. Butches are no more perfect than any other oppressed group. If being perfect were necessary for someone's oppression to be acknowledged as real and fought, no injustice would be fought. There are always a few individuals from every oppressed group who happen to fit the worst stereotypes of that group. But that doesn't make the stereotypes true or mean that the group or those individuals deserve oppression. The fact is that there are nasty individuals from all groups, and just as many or more individuals from the privileged group also fit the oppressed group stereotype. Responsible lesbians would never say classism is irrelevant because they know mean working-class dykes and kind middle-class dykes. Butch reality is so distorted and misrepresented that many lesbians forget to apply what they've learned about their own and others' oppressions to this issue. For this reason, one way to avoid being unintentionally reactionary is to temporarily substitute butches in your mind with a recognized oppressed group when you think or talk about roles. Fighting anti-butch attitudes benefits all lesbians, including femmes, because it means valuing strong dyke identity for every lesbian. Each of us has internalized some degree of anti-dyke propaganda, which we take out on ourselves and on each other. The main targets are butches, who are also the most pressured to internalize self-hatred. But the strong dyke inside every one of us is punished, repressed, and damaged by fear, hatred, and ambivalence towards butches. Whether as butches we internalize it against ourselves, or as femmes we externalize it against butches. It's way past time for us to say no to heterosexual demands that we hate our dyke selves, and yes to our love for each other's enduring, wild, determined female and dyke selves. I'm going to take a small break here. It's obviously very intense and pithy to read. I see people have been commenting, so hi everyone. In answer to Sophia Gully, the book is called Dykes-Loving-Dykes, Dyke Separatist Politics for Lesbians Only. Willow asked about me smirking about the spelling of women with a Y. I mean, I guess what was on my mind in that is my own experiences with oppressive women who do that. Or like, you know, to me, it's always been attached to a level of exclusivity, I guess. Even if that isn't necessarily like the dyke's intention that uses it, or non-dykes sometimes. I don't think that it's wrong to necessarily change the spelling of woman. I understand why women do it, but I also think that sometimes when we do these things, it sets up like that kind of dynamic as well. And I prefer to just be as straightforward about things as possible. When I talk about myself as a woman, I don't want to do that, I guess, because I don't see it as being different. I also, when I talk about being a woman, I think of it as a role anyway. So a cultural role. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it, I guess. That's why I smirked. Ugh. All right. Hello, Radical by Choice. All right, so I'm going to keep reading on here. We'll see how far I get. It's an important piece, though, so I want to get through as much of it as possible. So give me a definition. A definition is both easy and difficult. When we describe roles, some lesbians immediately recognize what we mean. Those who do not want to understand will recognize themselves in other lesbians. Oh, sorry, those who do want to understand. For others, no definition satisfies them unless it's a stereotype. Those who want to avoid the issue or, quote-unquote, just don't understand are expressing their resistance to the truth, just as some het women don't understand how anyone can be a lesbian. The complex realities of our role identities can't be reduced to a brief, glib sentence or two. This entire chapter is our attempt to define and explain roles. For those with awareness of roles, it's obvious. You can usually tell when you first meet someone whether she's butch or femme. Sometimes you can tell just by hearing a lesbian's voice. It's much easier, for instance, than identifying someone's class background when you know nothing about them. Yet for lesbians who aren't aware of roles, it seems to be difficult at first. One way to work out someone's role is to notice how you feel around her. What's your gut reaction? How do you feel effeminate? Who do you feel effeminate in relation to? When do you feel like a clumsy clod? How queer or how normal do you feel around a lesbian? When you feel like yourself, when do you feel like yourself? Butches and less feminine femmes tend to feel clumsy when they're around the extremely feminine. Oh god, yeah. Femmes, including the least feminine, tend to feel more feminine around a butch. And that's true too. Butches are more likely to recognize what a lesbian's role is because butches are greatly oppressed by roles. Femmes who've also suffered because of other femmes role-playing may recognize roles more easily too. Butches tend to know more about roles and about femmes, just as other oppressed groups tend to know more about the oppressor's culture than vice versa. The femmes we call queens will also recognize immediately who's butch and who's femme for their own predatory reasons. Queens are the most obvious role players. Some are so feminine that they look like drag queens, but others are more subtle. They may look like strong dykes, but their actions reveal their oppressive attitudes. Queens generally treat butches as sex objects, treat less feminine femmes as if we were of no consequence, and treat other queens as rivals. Butchers are more like what we'd all be if we weren't subjected to intense feminization. Butches express femaleness and lesbianism more naturally, while femmes' femaleness and lesbianism is channeled through the acquired values of femininity. Femmes share those feminine values with men and heterosexual women, while butches' ways of being are furthest from those of men and het women. But there are exceptions. The institution of heterosexism has many aspects. Making one decision to resist male rule doesn't mean someone makes them all. Many poor and working-class het women from rural areas who do hard physical labor have none of the typical feminine mannerisms, and there are femmes who accepted some degree of femininity but never became het, while there are butches who were het and even wives and mothers. But there's a higher percentage of butches who were never het than femmes. Since most of the many lesbians who came out through the women's liberation movement are femmes, butches are in a minority. Nowadays, it's possible to go to a lesbian event and find yourself in a crowd of 100 femmes and 5 butches. Even though many radical lesbians say they reject the most obvious femininity of the femme stereotype, femme is still overwhelmingly the image presented in lesbian publications and books, and on record covers, long hair, sometimes dyed or bleached, in the styles clearly designated for women by men, plucked eyebrows, cosmetics, earrings, long painted fingernails, dresses, skirts, and high heels. Besides these images and photographs, there are also drawings of exaggerated femininity. Even when the image is supposedly more lesbian, with short hair and pants, there's usually some male-defined womanliness, a touch of feminine jewelry, pointed fingernails, a dainty, unnatural hand positioned, and or an expression that's commonly found on models, narcissistic, arrogant, coy, seductive, cute, graceful, or posed sweetness, rather than plain dyke directness. A few images project a proper motherly or grandmotherly expression, which is also acceptably feminine. Most lesbian feminist media stars are clearly femme, although that was less true in the early 70s. Many look het, but even those who look like lesbians convey their feminist by the tilt of their head, their facial expressions, and the way they talk. Many femmes speak in a higher-pitched voice than is natural for them. On virtually every leaflet or advertisement we've seen for lesbian conferences, meetings, support groups, and dances, the image is clearly femme. This is a political statement saying who the organizers consider representative of our lesbian culture and who is welcome and who isn't. This not only excludes butches, but dyke-identified femmes as well. It's as elitist as high prices and a lack of sliding scale, which say for the moneyed only. When the common images are also of thin, young, able-bodied, class-privileged, European descent Gentiles, then even more lesbians are excluded. But while there's some growing consciousness about including groups of lesbians other than these most privileged ones, there seems to be a decrease in including images of obvious dykes. We suggest that it's better to not use any images of lesbian faces or bodies on ads than to use ones that exclude any oppressed dykes. Femmes generally fit the image of how a woman is supposed to be, and butches don't. Notice how much unease or unease a lesbian feels with feminine apparel, or how easily she passes or could pass for het. We can all change our appearance, but body language is revealing. Femmes are more likely to move and make gestures in ways that are traditionally feminine, including the flapping wrist or playing with their hair when talking, even if it's only an inch long. Also, it's not unusual for a femme to dress and wear her hair clearly like a dyke one year and look very het the next. Looking out has been a fad for many, but fads pass, and many femmes ultimately reveal a craving to follow the drag queen ideal. Dyke-identified dykes, whether femme or butch, are repulsed by that crap. Femmes are more likely to be obsessed with their looks and what they like and dislike about their bodies. They're more likely to spend a great deal of time preparing their appearance as if they're going on display, just as het women do. They're also more likely to notice other lesbians' appearance and make critical comments about how they look. Femmes are also more likely to act motherly. We've never met a motherly butch who wasn't an actual mother, but we've met many motherly femmes who aren't mothers, and butch mothers tend to be less in the motherly role of being critical and policing. But that doesn't mean that non-motherly butches and femme dykes aren't loving, caring, protective, and nurturing. Contrary to het propaganda, those are dyke qualities, not inherent mother qualities. Butch and femme identity goes so much deeper than the superficiality usually talked about. Some butches convince themselves they're not butch because they're good cooks, like doing craft work, make a cozy home, hate sports, and/or are intimidated by mechanical tasks. Some femmes think they're not femme because they hate femininity and are comfortable doing traditionally male work like carpentry and mechanics. A more accurate way to recognize roles is by noticing who has the power in social and intimate relationships. Femme privilege carries a lot of clout in lesbian social interactions. One honest femme's self-recognition list. When I first meet another lesbian, if all other things are equal, more or less, I feel less difference with femmes. Even when there are other differences between us, such as class, when it comes to roles, feminist is an area of similarity. With a butch, I feel the potential barrier that any major difference creates. We're on different ground. We can't assume we know how each other feels. We can't assume our experiences have been very different and that, as a result, we're likely to feel different about a lot of things. That's true of any two lesbians, but every difference in privilege and oppression widens the gap and requires more conscious effort to achieve understanding and closeness. Until developing radical dyke politics, I never had any qualms about identifying as a woman and had no trouble being accepted as one by hets. I feel myself moving like a femme and automatically using some feminine gestures. They're not exaggerated, but are obviously different from how butches move and act. I don't pass as het, but feel relatively confident I could pass as a het if necessary. Not a polished version, but adequate. Feminine activities like sewing, needlecrafts, cooking, and other things designated as women's work feel like something that belongs to me and to my sphere of activity. Some I enjoy, some I'm indifferent to, and some I hate. But somehow they all belong to me. I remember the years it took to train me in some of those skills and how bitterly I hated most of them at first. But in the end, I accepted them as second nature. No one thinks it's odd to see me doing these activities. While butches who are comfortable and skilled with this kind of work are often teased and ridiculed by both butches and femmes. Often butches show friendliness to me by acting protective, solicitous, and even deferential. This is especially true of old dyke butches. They don't usually act that way toward other butches. I can tell that I'm less uncomfortable among het women than butches are. I don't need to be as on guard because het women don't act as scared, hateful, or predatory, flirtatious towards me, especially if a butch is present. They focus on the most queer lesbian present. If I'm alone with het women, they sometimes do act that way. However, no het woman has ever pretended after a long conversation that she thought I was a man, which has happened to butch friends who are very obviously female. But I don't play roles. It makes sense that some otherwise responsible lesbians don't want to acknowledge that we're all either butch or femme because 1, hets use this propaganda to obscure their outrageously extreme role-playing. 2, dykes don't want to admit doing things that seem to confirm het stereotypes of us. 3, role-playing is a negative stereotype of old dykes who are looked down on by the newer ex-het feminist femmes. 4, S&M lesbians and quote-unquote lesbian porn glorify role-playing. 5, the even newer ex-het femmes who came out after the women's liberation movement and who are therefore much less oppressed as lesbians often think it's campy, cute, thrillingly naughty, and trendy to play with roles. Of the many femmes who deny being femme, some claim to be butch, and others claim to be neither butch nor femme. How can any dyke consider herself role-free? To anyone with any awareness of roles, it's easy to identify the role of even someone you don't personally know just from a photograph or from a lesbian's voice and way of speaking. When you're privileged, you can take your position for granted, but when you're oppressed, you can't avoid noticing it. Whether or not a dyke chooses to identify her femness, she should be aware that butches are treated as butches no matter how we identify. She should at least notice and resist the way she's treated as more normal by both hets and other lesbians. Some never-het femmes associate femness with heterosexuality and are understandably unwilling to identify as femmes, but they still benefit, although to a lesser degree, from femme privilege. A sound analysis of heterosexism among lesbians clarifies both issues: butch oppression and never-het dyke oppression. Some femmes claim it's quote-unquote masochistic to identify as a femme because they accept and perpetuate the lie that femmes are oppressed by butches like women are oppressed by men. The truth is that butches are oppressed by femmes similarly to how lesbians are oppressed by het women. Fighting femininity is an essential part of fighting sadomasochism. Accusing politically responsible femmes of self-hatred because we acknowledge femme privilege is just another way of trying to silence discussion about butch oppression. Should everyone just grab whatever privilege they can with no concern for who pays for it? Lesbians who refuse to use our privilege and who fight injustice, whether about butch oppression or any other issue, should be respected for our courage instead of being called masochistic. Fighting inequality benefits everyone. Who wants to live in communities where some feel good about themselves at others' expense? Many femmes claim that butches are more privileged and admired in the lesbian communities. Some dykes do support other dykes to stop being feminine and to be dyke-identified in appearance and behavior. But that doesn't mean butches are considered superior. Similarly, working-class culture occasionally getting respect doesn't mean that the working class now have privilege over the middle class. Oppression is real and observable. Privilege means gaining real concrete advantages. The two don't reverse simply because oppression is recognized. When femmes complain about pressure to look and act like dykes, it's like het feminists complaining about being pushed to come out. There's far more pressure on all of us to feminize in the male and het world, our families, and lesbian communities as well. The support to be more dyke-identified is minuscule compared to that. Butches are under unrelenting pressure to look more quote-unquote normal by mothers, other family members, co-workers, and even lovers and lesbian friends. If we do feminize ourselves, we're rewarded by being told how much nicer we look. Many butches have succumbed to this pressure over the years. Ironically, some femmes who are temporarily playing at being quote-unquote butch pressure other femmes and butches to act more tough, their erroneous image of butchness. They're the ones we've noticed being the most likely to make nasty anti-femme comments and jokes, another part of their erroneous image of butches, which isn't the same as honest resistance to femness. is scapegoating other femmes for your privilege. A femme who we knew who used to make frequent anti-butch comments was told why this was oppressive. She then tried to make herself appear more butch and began making anti-femme comments. It's much more acceptable for femmes to reject femininity than it is for butches, who are perceived as going too far. In fact, the lesbians who are most praised for being butch are usually less obvious femmes. This makes identifying lesbian roles more difficult, especially when newly out femme lesbians are inclined to think of almost all longer out lesbians as quote-unquote butch. The book's name is in the description bar. It's called Dykes-Loving-Dykes. I'll show you the cover. It's by Bev Jo, Linda Strega, and Rustin. And it's all available online. If you Google it, you can find Bev put it on her blog years ago, so you can read every chapter. Let's see. There's much more anti-butch than anti-femme sentiment among lesbians. At a lesbian forum in San Francisco, the audience cheered when it was announced that several members were femmes, and they cheered again when another lesbian described herself as a recovering butch. U.S. gay papers print many personal ads making statements like, feminine lesbian wants pretty lesbian who looks like a woman, or quote-unquote, no butches, please. In one such ad, the lesbian stated her bias clearly. I'm most comfortable in this straight world acting straight. I truly dislike the gay scene, roles, butches, dykes, etc. I'm not secretly looking to quote-unquote come out, so no helpful offers, please. My closet has always been warm, cozy, and exciting. Ugh. We've occasionally seen some support of butches in lesbian and feminist publications, although it's still vastly outnumbered by anti-butch statements. In criticizing a play about lesbian battery for showing the victim as obviously more femme than the abuser, one reviewer wrote, "It is necessary to note that the lesbian abuser can as easily be a 5'2" woman in a high voice and big dimples as she can be the tough butch image." In a workshop on lesbian identity at the first Encuentro gathering of Latin American and Caribbean feminist lesbians in Cuernavaca, Mexico, several women noted that it is generally the butch that is regarded with distaste. We need to accept the butches among us, and thereby reject heterosexist attitude. D.E. Clark wrote about butches. I've never seen butchdom as a cardboard replica of masculinity, never met a butch who felt to me socially like a man, never felt from a butch the sense of violence that underlies most male social congress. Many butches of my experience have an almost exaggerated gentleness. I contrast this with the all-out violence of which women are capable who believe themselves weak and powerless. Butches come in for a lot of teasing, aggravation. To me, it feels like queerbaiting, but from Dykes. It's a kind of violence to refuse a butch her identity. Just don't use those words. Like other inequalities among lesbians, butch oppression isn't something the privileged, in this case femmes, have the right to disagree exists. Butch oppression does exist, and femmes either act honestly and responsibly about it, or they refuse to, which is the luxury of the privileged. When even the most well-meaning and otherwise radical femme says, I don't agree with the issue of butch oppression, she's denying the existence, identity, experiences, and lives of butches. It's more honest to say, I don't want to be irresponsible about my femme privilege. I don't want to face up to lesbian oppression, rather than to liberally act like it's just a matter of opinion for femmes to deign to make decisions about. Butches simply don't have that luxury. We use the terms butch and femme because although we're not certain of their origin, it's likely butches chose them as a way of expressing their oppression. Butch isn't only a political term, it's an identity. To delete the term is to delete that identity. To replace it, as some lesbians have suggested, is to gloss over reality with euphemism. It's as closet It's as closet as calling lesbians women loving women. Butch, like Dyke, reclaims an insulting, shocking word as a term of pride and courage. And to soothe femme's discomfort by deleting femme is to delete Butch and the entire issue. Femme accurately describes the origin of femness, femininity. When femmes say, I agree with some of your points, but not those words, they remind us of Rustin's het sister who said about Rustin being a lesbian, I don't mind what you do, just don't use that word. The Big Sellout, Lesbian Femininity by Linda Strega. I love this piece, so if give me a second, I'm going to stretch and take another sip of water. I've only been mistaken for a man a handful of times, and sometimes I wonder, too, if somebody's just being nasty, although it's possible. Oh, dear. I'm getting a call. Hello? Hello? Well, that was weird. It's interesting, too. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, so... Yeah. I identify as a femme because of my experiences with practicing femininity and being more comfortable, I think, and with falling into those patterns. Even though I've had a lot of experiences that I think are also, times in which I've felt like not like other girls, But I am Terry Strange, so I feel like part of my existence has always been to feel a little odd compared to others. And I think that's also a part of lesbian identity itself. So what I would say, like, in terms of understanding that, how do you feel when you're with other lesbians? That's, I think, more where it comes down to. When you're with a butch woman, how do you feel as a woman? And how do you feel as a woman when you're with a femme woman? And that's really what it comes down to in terms of understanding who you are and how you are. It's really about your energy and how you interact with other dykes. I mean, that's the only way I can really say it. And also in comparison to, like, you can get some of this with het women for sure, but yeah, ultimately it's about, like, how you feel with other lesbians that really determines that. Okay. And also, I mean, too, even though I'm femme, I have had, like, the teasing and, like, kind of weird behavior that happens. And I think that has to do a lot with, like, the layers of femininity that a woman's operating from. So anyway, let's move on. The Big Sellout, Lesbian Femininity. In the 1980s, a decade of reactionary politics, femininity became an accepted value among many lesbians, even many politically radical lesbians who I would most expect to support lesbian self-love and self-respect, who usually call prick bullshit for what it is, began to openly admire feminine ways of dressing and acting. Femininity, a patriarchal superhype if there ever was one, a phony ideal created by men, not by lesbians. An ideal that heterosexual women embody to please men. Femininity is no way an inborn aspect of femaleness. Our most innate qualities as females can never be developed through the restraining, artificial posing, game playing, and mirror gazing that is femininity. Men have taught women what they want women to be. They call it feminine or womanly. As lesbians, we need to be awake enough to realize that this male invention is masculine to the core, no matter what it's named, no matter how many women go along with the lie. Femininity is not truly female. The similarity in the words is a lying male trick. Lesbians' acceptance of anything feminine is part of the weakening of lesbian politics, a lesbian parallel to the right-wing trend of het politics. This same is true of the popularity of sadomasochism among many lesbians. In fact, S&M encourages the reacceptance of femininity as positive, erotic style among otherwise radical lesbians. I've heard shallow reasoning that if some lesbians enjoy it and can't stop wanting it, then it's better to go ahead and accept it. That's the kind of irresponsible, reactionary politics too often supported by psychotherapy. It's the same liberalness that supports lesbians going het, becoming bisexual, and having babies. It's the same self-destructiveness that leads lesbians to accept thinness as a standard, that calls the slow suicide of dieting, eating healthy, and the self-punishment of over-exercising, staying fit, and that encourages lesbians to worry about the effects of aging on their appearance. Those are all male het values. Feminine values. They all revolve around how men want women to act and look, and they all derive from male desires to control female behavior. Those lesbians who act out the feminine model and claim it's a contribution to lesbian culture, a flowering forth of their real selves, are of course femmes, and very often femmes who were once heterosexual. They haven't gotten rid of old het values, which are now resurfacing in this reactionary time. The het media is full of stories, articles, and images of the het feminist who realizes she doesn't have to give up being a woman to be a success in life, and who regrets having tried to be like a man and is now rediscovering the excitement of feminine seductiveness, the fun of dressing up in high heels, makeup, and swishy clothes, and her deep need for the joys of motherhood. Sound familiar? Doesn't sound too different from lots of lesbian media, does it? Femme privilege, who pays for it? During the past decade, I've read many articles and stories written by femme lesbians that celebrate femme role-playing as positive, fun, and erotic. It's not just the writings that alarm me. I've encountered the same trend at lesbian social and political events, even among otherwise radical lesbians. By contrast, articles I've read about being butch show conflict, self-questioning, self-criticism, and pain. The same contrast occurs in most discussions I've had with other dykes about femme and butch identity, and is one of the many indications that butches are in an oppressed position relative to femmes. I've been identifying myself openly as femme since 1979, and have been gradually developing a political analysis about butch oppression with a few close dyke separatist friends. I define myself as a femme not because I admire and enjoy femininity or want to develop my femme qualities, but because I recognize that I accepted feminine training as a girl. Why I didn't resist when butch girls did is now unknown to me, part of the forgotten past. What's important to me now is how that choice affects me and other lesbians in the present. Being accepted as a real girl by the het world, and therefore my own self, has given me the bearing, manner, and lack of doubt about being a real woman that femme privilege bestows, even though I don't now identify as a woman, but as a lesbian or a dyke. I try to avoid oppressive femme behavior, but I know that because of my history, I will always be femme. If I claim to have become butch because of rejecting femme clothing and behavior, that would be as untrue and offensive as a class-privileged lesbian saying she's poor, working class now, because she doesn't have much money and rejects classist values. Is it possible to be neither butch nor femme, as most lesbian feminists claim about themselves? From my observations, no. Every girl is faced with the choice of either submitting to feminization and being accepted, or resisting and being punished. The pressure on girls to feminize themselves is universal and unrelenting. It exists in every patriarchal culture, and I don't know of any culture in the world today which isn't patriarchal. The styles of femininity vary in quality and degree from culture to culture, but in every patriarchal culture, woman is defined by her allegiance and orientation towards male values and desires. I believe that butch and femme roles are chosen at such an early age. They can be observed in 4-year-old girls, that they have a profound effect on how we feel within ourselves, how we interact with each other, and how we're treated by the het world. For the rest of our lives, a small girl is surrounded by only 2 models of gender behavior. She lives in that world and says and believes women dress and act like this, and men dress and act like that, and anyone who's not a woman is a man. If something in her cannot and will not accept the artificial trappings and mannerisms of the feminine role, everyone around her begins telling her she's not really a girl. As she gets older and still resists femininity, the accusations intensify. When her lesbian identity becomes obvious, she's labeled a deviant, a freak of nature, a man in a woman's body. She isn't supposed to exist. She's a big threat to the big lie of feminine woman. And so men and their women collaborators make up all kinds of ridiculous, hateful fictions to explain away her existence. The pressure is meant to humiliate and bully her into accepting femininity, and it must indeed put her through soul-shaking self-doubt, even if she knows other butches. Too often she doesn't meet other butches for many years, but faces the onslaught alone during the most vulnerable years of her life, her girlhood. Sometimes butch girls are partially accepted in their families and among friends, but as a kind of mascot or pet, not as an equal. After all, it's helpful to have an outcast around, someone who's at the bottom of the pecking order for those further up to feel superior to. Meanwhile, girls who accept femininity, the vast majority, unfortunately are accepted as real girls and encouraged to take pride in their feminine ways. There are degrees of femininity, of course. Some femme girls accept the complete emaciated drag queen sex object ideal, while others take on just enough feminine identity to still be acceptable as real girls. But because of Het's fanaticism about real womanhood, they do set a rigid line. Any girl who refuses to make some concession to feminine requirements is pushed over the line. That is, she's denied the right to be called normal. Not only is she, quote-unquote, not really a woman, she's pushed outside the bounds of normal society, which judges that it owes her nothing and has the right to destroy her. She's become a danger to male rule instead of a saleable item in the het marketplace. Femme privilege is based on retaining a claim to that normal standing that butches are completely denied. Even though femme lesbians are seriously oppressed as lesbians, we're still treated by hets as if we're more like women than butches are. Butches receive a more extreme version of het's insistence on seeing lesbians as unnatural. When young butch and femme lovers are found out by very angry het guardians, who gets the most blame and punishment? You can bet it's not the femme. The usual interpretation, as we all know, is that disgusting bulldagger shouldn't be allowed around decent, innocent little girls. Because femmes in varying degrees fit more closely the male-created ideal of real woman, we're more privileged than butches, both in the het world and in lesbian communities. Because butches have rejected feminine conditioning more completely, they're treated as being more queer, more suspect, more unnatural. Ex-het femmes get more normal privilege than never-het femmes, and ex-married femmes and mothers get even more privilege. An ex-het butch and a never-het femme are in a position to oppress each other, but when they're both never-het or both ex-het, the butch will be more oppressed than the femme. Hets don't relate to femme lesbians with the same degree of vicious queer-hating, even though we do get it, especially if we're dressing and acting in a more dyke-identified way. It's never as bad as what a butch gets. As is always the case with oppression, we've internalized these privileges and oppressions so that butches and femmes alike tend to treat femmes as if we were more like real women, more deserving of care and attention. Meanwhile, butches are viewed as being male-identified. What could be more insulting, untrue, and oppressive? Patriarchal het society defines only 2 genders, man and woman. Woman is not a biological definition as men claim. It's actually an artificial social definition invented by men. It defines what men want females to be, a submissive being who bonds emotionally, mentally, and physically only with men. According to this scheme, if you're not a woman, namely a male-identified female, then you're some kind of man, or trying to be a man. You're unnatural. So lesbians, by choosing to bond with other females instead of with men, are defined by hets as being like men. Notice that only lesbians really give primary allegiance to other females. Het women and all men give primary allegiance to men. The comparison of lesbians to men is inaccurate, even regarding the choice of who we bond with. Butch stereotypes. Who benefits from them? Femmes seriously injure butches when they believe and act on butch-hating stereotypes. That damage is increased, not diminished, when femmes romanticize butches as having erotic power or falsely assume that lesbians value butchness more highly than femness. That's not respect, it's objectification. It's similar to class-privileged lesbians romanticizing poor and working-class lesbians and feeling sorry for themselves because they're the wrong class. If you pay attention to how lesbians actually treat each other, it becomes obvious that femmes are treated more like real people, real women, while butches are treated as more queer, more in need of feminism. Feminism has remained extremely heterosexist and anti-lesbian, and so it supports the male ideals of feminine values. That's why, as most ex-het lesbians who came out in the women's liberation movement think that butches are in a role, but that femmes are not. Like with other privileges, feminist is considered the norm. And of course, it's those with privilege who have the power to define what the norm is. Butches, especially old dykes, are considered unfeminist by ex-het women liberation femmes and are accused of not being woman-identified, a trendy, indirect way of saying not womanly. This is horribly oppressive because they're saying butches are like our oppressors. The fact is, butches are more truly female-identified than the femmes who criticize them. It's butches' rejection of femininity that offends these femmes. Never does it occur to such femmes that they themselves are the ones who need to become more female-identified. That is, more lesbian-identified. The womanliness they value so much isn't basic to female nature at all. Butch's insistence on lesbian strength, directness, and independence from male definitions is more truly female. Women's liberation feminism is concerned with making heterosexuality more comfortable for women. Why should any lesbian want to support such anti-lesbian, anti-female reformism? Most ex-het women's liberation femmes have been too arrogant because of their het and femme privilege and lesbophobia to realize that it's they who have something to learn from butches who are lifelong dykes. Butches have been made so invisible in lesbian feminist communities that many femmes are mistakenly assumed to be butches if they're less feminine or play at being butch. Many femmes believe themselves to be butches. Some femmes who are male-identified want to be like men. They mistakenly think that's what dykes are, and so mistakenly think that means that they're butches. Some femmes who are also privileged in other ways, like looks, thinness, and class, get some power among other lesbians by playing at being butch. They may be admired for managing to act butchy without going too far, but they certainly don't experience butch oppression. On the other hand, there are more oppressed femmes who get pressured into a butch-like role and are objectified as sexual servicers by more privileged and more feminine femmes. When two femmes are lovers or friends, if one is more oppressed because of being darker, fatter, or older, having less looks privilege, less class privilege, less or no het privilege, or no het experience, or being more dyke separatist, she's likely to be considered the less feminine of the two, and therefore the butch. This just adds to her existing oppression. She's more likely to understand the nature of butch oppression as a result of being treated like a butch at times, although she'll never be as oppressed as she would if she was actually butch. Her feelings won't be considered to be important or as sensitive as her lover's. Her lovemaking may not be reciprocated, and her lover may interpret everything she does through the distorted screen of lesbophobia, all because the butch in the couple is the one who's considered more queer than her lover. Hets often assume that feminine-looking lesbians are really bisexual or het. I don't think that assumption is 100% het ignorance. Feminine clothing, hairstyles, behavior, obsession with dieting, and with male-approved appearance are all forms of social communication that say I'm willing to please men, or at the very least, I accept men's dictates in dress and behavior. I'm not as queer or as a butch. I'm really rather normal. Generally, femmes can pass as het more easily than butches, no matter how hard we may try to be out. But femmes who reject feminine values and try to be visibly out are treated as more queer than others. We're in a position to be oppressed by femmes who are selling out, and we're more natural allies for butches. Some femmes enjoy the fact that men and or het women like their femness. Some ex-het femmes are still caught up with male approval, even if it takes the form of thinking, you men like what you see, but you can't have me anymore. I've actually read that written by a femme in a quote-unquote dyke publication, and I've heard lesbians talk that way. Lesbians who play those sexual games with men are making both the games and the men more important to them than lesbian identity and solidarity. Other lesbians use feminine clothes and behavior simply to make themselves safer from queer oppression, trying to blend in more with het ways. Whatever the reasons, it's all at the expense of butches, who by being the most blatant and public resistance fighters against heterosexist values by not catering to het approval at all, become the targets for the most intense punishment from the het world. After all, if even other lesbians, femmes, are willing to play that part of the het game, are willing to dress and change their bodies with dieting, shaving, and altering of their hair, as men dictate, that supports the het pressure on butches to do the same, not to mention the racism, ageism, looksism, and fat oppression involved in doing those things. Some of my understanding about butch oppression comes from how I've been treated by het women, by more feminine femmes, and by anti-separatist femmes who think of separatists as being like the worst sort of men. At those times, I'm treated a little bit as if I were butch, as if I were very queer and not quite female. Not a nice feeling, and it gets worse as time goes on, as I get older and have been out longer. While it's happening, it's made me feel, in weaker moments, as if there might be something monstrous about me. The effects of being viewed as unnatural go very deep, no matter how much I know they're wrong, no matter how strong I am. And I am very strong and politically aware. It's so insulting and objectifying to be seen as being like your worst enemy, men. That's the kind of thing that's continuously done to butches. Sometimes it's done by femme lesbians in the convoluted way of romanticizing butches as lovers, wanting to be pursued and swept off their feet, wanting to be the one who is made love to and not caring to focus the same attention on her lover, wanting to experience the butch lover as other, as some kind of opposite, as mysteriously being more powerful, stronger, braver. The honest admiration and respect that a butch could arouse in another lesbian, femme, or butch gets distorted into a het-like power game, an addiction to inequality. With the femme in a power position and pretending not to be. It's not honest, it's not respectful, and it sure isn't love. Why romanticize butches' courage and risk-taking while letting them get the worst of the punishment from the het world, do most of the work of maintaining lesbian visibility, and be used by femmes to celebrate the femmes' power to attract? What about femmes trying to develop some of those butch qualities they claim to admire so much? Many femmes have done that, but the trend toward femininity is eroding support for defeminization and replacing it with strong pressure to feminize. What about femmes recognizing our privileged and oppressive position? What about trying to stop the sexualizing of power imbalances? What about acknowledging that acting out of privilege is, of course, going to feel more comfortable, but that doesn't make it all right? That privilege is why many femmes are now saying, I enjoy being a femme, while butches express more conflict, soul-searching, discomfort, self-criticism, and pain about their role. The extent to which degrading anti-butch attitudes are accepted and challenged among lesbians shows in the following description of a sex video advertised prominently in the May 1985 issue of a local lesbian and gay newspaper. For the lesbian S&M connoisseur, butch is taught a few manners in femme worship. Anyone having a hard time recognizing the hatred in this ad only needs to substitute the name of any other oppressed group for butch and the corresponding privileged group for femme, and feel what your gut reaction is. The depth of lesbian oppression is such that it's often easier for us to react emotionally to an issue, which isn't particularly and solely about lesbians. I've met many ex-het femmes who, because of their lesbophobic assumption about roles, think femmes are oppressed by butches. When I asked one ex-het, ex-married lesbian mother what she meant by saying she, as a femme, felt oppressed by butches, she answered that it was an extension of how I was oppressed as a heterosexual woman. This lesbian is unfortunately far from unique in thinking of a butch as another sort of man, and she'd been a radical lesbian for years when she had said that. Her attitudes and het privilege don't vanish upon coming out. Even after years of being a political lesbian, they have to be recognized, analyzed, and consciously resisted, just like any other oppressive beliefs and behaviors. So many times I've heard ex-het women's liberation lesbians say things like, she's an old bar dyke, a butch, but she's learning a lot from feminists. Sound familiar? So far, I haven't heard anyone say, she's an ex-het women's liberation femme, but she's learning a lot from lifelong butch dykes. Have you? If you have, please let me know. I'd love to meet your friends. The het woman's uniform versus lesbian identity. I've been verbally assaulted, that's exactly how it feels, at meetings, at friends' parties, and even in my own home by femme lesbians who wear some form of femme drag and want to know why I don't dress up, why I want to wear a uniform. This offensive militaristic male imagery is openly lesbian hating. They're the ones wearing the male-approved feminine uniform. They complain about how terribly pressured they feel to wear dyke clothes. Yet in every case, these femmes aggressively initiated talking about clothes. I don't go around confronting lesbians who dress feminine, nor does anyone else I know who feels the same as I do about this issue. We're usually too busy defending ourselves against attacks on our lack of femininity. Meanwhile, I've often been treated to the outrageous injustice of hearing feminine lesbians praised for their courage in displaying their femininity. Where's the courage in perpetuating male and het values? One femme, another ex-het, ex-married mother, even gave me a long lecture at my own kitchen table about how the dyke look, butch, is really a European descent middle-class style. She claimed that racially oppressed lesbians and working-class and poor lesbians like to dress up femme. She herself is European descent, working-class, Protestant raised. For her, apparently racially oppressed butches and working class and poor butches either don't exist or don't count. Not to mention myself, sitting in front of her, a working class femme who hates feminine clothes and rejects the idea that femme drag is dressing up in any positive sense. I also didn't count. Why do our critics assume I and other dykes don't know what a uniform is? None of us want regimentation. We have an infinite variety of color, pattern, and detail within our traditional dyke clothes, as any large group of dykes shows. And why are the ancient universal cultural traditions we've developed as an oppressed people shown such disrespect? Many oppressed groups of people express their cultural identity and recognize each other through wearing traditional clothes unique to them, with individual variation according to taste. People who invade others' lands and suppress their cultures forbid traditional clothing as one of the first steps of genocide. Reclaiming traditional clothes is often one of the first steps in resisting cultural destruction. They're worn as a statement of pride. Dykes wear dyke clothing for similar reasons. Yet the same liberal men and women and het-identified lesbians who've never dream of attacking other people's cultural style don't hesitate to attack us for ours. The clothes I and other dykes wear aren't the same kind men designate for women. They're the cheaper, sturdier, warmer in cold weather, less constricting, and more protective clothing that men would like to reserve for themselves. Wearing them is not only more comfortable and functional, it also makes it more obvious to anyone who sees me, including other dykes, that I'm a dyke. They also make it easier for me to defend myself if a male attacks me. My dyke clothes free my movements to be more natural to myself, because they don't require the artificial constraints that feminine clothes do. The smaller steps, legs kept together, restricted shoulder movements, the fussing with hair, jewelry, and makeup that we're used to seeing in women. When I refer to restricted body movement, I'm not talking about inherent physical ability. Whatever one's physical ability, clothing can either restrict or allow maximum use of one's body. My clothes aren't male clothes, they're lesbian clothes. They symbolize dykes' deep refusal to be men's sex toys, and because they're forbidden to us, they also represent our refusal to follow male orders. Those who have a deep awareness of patriarchal dress codes are aware that the more seemingly reasonable feminine slacks and blouses that many lesbians accept still conform to male dictates. For example, if they weren't specifically for women, feminine shirts wouldn't be called blouses. This isn't a word game. Clothes designated for women have fewer pockets, are less well made, and often more expensive. Even unisex clothing reserves better quality, convenience, and comfort for the men's and boys' versions. I call feminine clothes drag because they're a male-invented, phony game-playing het costume. Het women's lives are based on lies that are repeated and acted out so often that the truths about themselves as females and potential lesbians are buried deeper than deep. Het women are dead to themselves as true females as long as they choose to remain het. There's nothing in their lives, their values, their thoughts and desires as het women that can give lesbians anything but the cold touch of death. They don't know what the needs of a female soul are, or they wouldn't be het. They wouldn't be nurturing their very enemy. Then why are so many lesbians imitating het women, or in some cases going back to values they had when they themselves were het? Femininity isn't a harmless diversion or form of self-expression. It's not creative, it's not freeing, it's not daring or sexy. It's just the same tired, phony, heterosexist crap. Spend plenty of time and energy on your nail polish, hairdos, dresses, diets, body-shaping exercises, poses, and games. Fantasize yourself as the center of sexual attention. Make everything into a sexual game. Get yourself further and further away from female reality, from real female lesbian power. Identify more and more with het values. Shit, you could be that woman in the lipstick commercial. Just substitute a butch lesbian for the prick that's panting after her. If your lover or friend doesn't like that kind of crap, you'll teach her how fun it can be. How much time and interest does this leave you for lesbian politics, fighting patriarchy, forming real lesbian cultures? Why be a lesbian at all if you so admire male and het values? I don't understand the pleasure some femmes claim to get from feminine drag, but I know it's connected to heterosexist privilege. That is, it's het created. Het approved, het rewarded, and anti-lesbian. I don't know why most girls accept feminine training when clearly it's possible to resist it as butch girls do, but I do know from experience that femme lesbians have the choice and ability to recognize the lie for what it is and to reprogram ourselves. Our politics change our feelings about a lot of things. Think of certain movies or books you really enjoyed before you became politically aware, ones that disgust you now because your awareness is sharper, and your gut feelings respond to your present knowledge. I feel that way about the feminine clothes I admired as a little girl. I feel angry about the clownish yet sexually suggestive crap pushed on unknowing little girls, miniature versions of what adult het women wear to advertise their fuckability to men. Feminine clothes and games aren't something that can just be tacked onto a lesbian's otherwise political life without affecting her and other lesbians in deeply damaging ways. Those feminine things are male-invented signals and symbols. They're the results of female submission and collaboration. We can't transcend or reclaim them. They're in no way neutral. They're loaded with meaning. They're actually masculine in the extreme. Any pleasure that's gotten from femininity is enjoyed at the expense of lesbians who are oppressed by it, especially butches, who are made to feel like misfit minorities in their own communities. It also oppresses lesbians like me who feel miserable and degraded in feminine drag, and who've experienced the queer-baiting game playing of queenie femmes. It also makes it much harder for lesbians like me to identify ourselves openly as femme and discuss butch oppression because it reinforces other lesbian stereotypes about what being femme means. Not all femmes want to cultivate femininity. Many of us, especially dyke separatists, are resisting it wholeheartedly. We're trying to strengthen our lesbian identities, not weaken them. Lesbians who dress feminine also make life harder and more dangerous for the rest of us in relation to the het world. They make blatant lesbians an even smaller minority who are therefore easier to discriminate against, harass, scapegoat, and brutalize. It makes it harder for us to get and hold jobs, welfare, or disability income, to be rented apartments, to attend schools, to get medical care, to go anywhere, to even just walk down the street. If all lesbians were obvious lesbians, we'd all be safer. There's a hell of a lot of us, and we'd be a force to be reckoned with. Butch's choice to resist femininity is the choice of a female who's being true to herself, choosing to be as alive to her female self as possible, regardless of the punishments inflicted on her as a result. I find that resistance a key to dyke power, dyke beauty, dyke love, and dyke integrity. Oof. Ugh. Then there's one more section which I'm going to read, but I'm going to take a quick break here before I dig into section 3 on roles. What do you all think so far? Are you familiar with this work? What is it bringing up for you? I'd love to know. Yeah. We got some clapping. All right. I'm going to use the restroom and I'll be right back to finish or to go into this, finish this section. Oof. I grabbed myself a little snack before I get started again too. I baked some brownies the other day, and this is the last one. Mm. I think it's like interesting to me to look through this again, especially since meeting like all the women from South Korea who are doing this escape the corset practice. And I saw that one of the women from Uruguay who follows my work, they had did a similar action where they like removed their hair and like destroyed all their makeup, which is super badass. But I did find, that I can't find as much, even though I've met some South Korean women who are lesbians, like it's the fact that like lesbians are pioneers in that kind of thing of like rejecting femininity, that's not like as big a part of the analysis that I found. But also a lot of this can be like cultural barriers and language barriers. No, you can't have this. You can't have my brownie. No, you can't. Hmm. Save a little bit of it for later. Mm. Is there like anything better than brownies? Mm. Yum. But I also think like apart from rejecting femininity as being like a important thing that all lesbians need to do, I also think it's important for heterosexual women to do it too. Is as they were saying in this, like if all lesbians were visible, it would make like it harder to oppress us. If all women rejected femininity, it would be impossible to scapegoat lesbians because like they wouldn't be able to do it as such. Come here, baby. Oh, hello. Do we fight? Did you dig your claws in me? Yeah. I love you. I love you, my kitty. Oh, that purr. That purr, though. No. My kitty friend. Which is like part of like why I think I admire like that is the escape the corset concept so much, because it is like total female solidarity. Like we all reject this thing, right? We all see it, we all name it, we all reject it. And it's like such a firm statement of like women standing together and like, not being divided by these concepts of beauty. So important. And also like just dressing like comfortably. I mean, it's so interesting that these ideas are considered radical when they just seem to be common sense, No. Mm. No. No. Kitty, kitty. Okay. So I'm feeling a little refreshed. Yeah. The people are saying that you want brownie. Do you want brownie? I bet you would sniff it and lick it a bit, but I don't think you would eat it. Mm. Mm. Can you all hear his little purr? Meow. 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 You better settle down. Settle down. Lay down. If you lay down, then we can hang. But if you're going to continue standing, I'm going to have to kick you off. All right, we've come to our compromise. All right. So this is part 3 on roles equal butch oppression. From the beginning of patriarchal rule, women who accepted the feminine role devised ways to manipulate the male oppressor through that role, as much as they could within the narrow limits of an oppressed position. What's appropriate when dealing with the oppressor is, however, inappropriate and cruel when used against other lesbians. It's particularly cruel towards butches, who are at the bottom of the heterosexist hierarchy. Femmes begin oppressing butches in girlhood, which is why we have some of the same painful experiences with each other now as we did with other girls in the past. Beginning in girlhood, the most feminine little girls are at the top of the heterosexist hierarchy among their peers, and are already active in punishing butch and less feminine girls through the many hostile games we all remember from our own pasts. They form exclusive cliques to ostracize and attempt to isolate the undesirables and ridicule the less feminine and the determinedly unfeminine. They slander less privileged, less feminine girls, deliberately damaging those girls' chances for friendships and acceptance by others. And they show off their feminine accomplishments and attributes in ways that make everyone else feel like clods. These are the girlhood versions of queens. As lesbians, queens don't always wear extremely feminine clothes and trappings, though they're the most likely to. It's their behavior that most distinguishes them as queens. Because their femininity makes them more acceptable, more normal-seeming by het standards, and because most lesbians have deeply internalized het standards, queens' power and manipulations are seldom recognized as such. A queen usually has many friends and staunch defenders, some of whom are hurt by her over and over. Somehow she's seldom perceived as being responsible for the pain, ruined relationships, and damaged political work she leaves in her wake. The lesbian we knew who said, "It's really different with lesbians than it is with men, isn't it?" was an ex-het queen who left a swath of heartbreak and self-hatred among lesbians she had manipulated and abandoned. Woo! Not putting up with that right now. Despite this minimal realization that lesbians aren't men several years later, she's still up to her old tricks, is considered very lesbian identified anyway, and still has friends who feel she's a fragile soul who needs their protection. Lesbians don't have to keep being vulnerable to this kind of heterosexist abuse from other lesbians. If we can analyze and understand what's going on, we can refuse to participate in it. Although not all femmes are queens, all femmes do identify with each other as being other than butch. This kind of bonding occurs within every privileged group, because there can't be an in-group without an out-group. And it takes in-group cooperation to maintain the lie of superiority. That's why a femme who calls attention to femmes' oppression of butches and is determined to fight that oppression angers other femmes and is subjected to efforts to silence her. Femmes who break femme bonding get punished. Even less feminine femmes always have the option of pulling rank and engaging in an occasionally queenly display, and many do so. The unquestioning, arrogant, smug assumption of superiority over butches is an oppressive quality shared by almost all femmes, and that alone supports lesbian hatred among us to a degree that's damaging to all lesbians and devastatingly cruel to butches. This is similar to how classist attitudes are ingrained in many class-privileged lesbians. They may not consciously think they're superior to poor and working-class lesbians, yet they act condescendingly and authoritative. The original real role players, men and het women. It's men and het women who truly play roles. Their roles are so much a part of the dominant male culture that they're taken for granted and considered to be natural. Men project onto females all of their own deficiencies, cowardice, illogic, inanity, dishonesty, treachery, pettiness, etc. And they push onto females an array of male-invented feminine mannerisms and styles that encourage weakness, dependence, submissiveness, and general fuckability. Such is the role of woman, yet we're supposed to believe it's natural to want to mince along on stilted shoes, face masked with stinking lurid chemicals, nails, bloody talons, dieted, jazzercised, depilated, plastic surgeried bodies encased in exposing dresses, voices unnaturally high, gestures cute and aggressively flirtatious, and minds focused on pleasing men at any cost. Meanwhile, men, who are raping female kind, destroying life on the planet, and in quieter moments, simply boring everyone to death, pretend exclusive possession of all valued qualities: strength, courage, nobility of heart, directness, honesty, wit, loyalty, intelligence, and independence. They also steal all comfortable, freedom-giving, attractive, and dignified clothes for themselves. These are truly grotesque, exaggerated roles, reversals of reality. They're collaborators, het women. Lesbians don't play roles like hets do. We're not like men and het women. The fact that male drag queens can pass as women should convince all lesbians that femininity is not natural. Some models in women's fashion magazines are reputed to be men in drag. Some drag queen entertainers have said that they make better women than any woman could. They're probably right. It's possible that men wish for females to look feminine reflects their own secret desire for themselves and other men to look like that. We suggest that if men so love dresses, makeup, and high heels, they should wear them. Question femmes, not butches. Feminine females, accepted and rewarded for cooperating with male dictates, are given the job of teaching and enforcing male-invented womanliness in other females. So het women praise femininity and punish resistance to it on behalf of men. They protect men's exclusive access to dignity, safety, comfort, and physical freedom. Oh no. Oh no. You ain't coming up here right now. You're rambunctious. You're out of control. You're going over the line. You've gone too far. Get your claw out of me. Ooh. Ooh, you're not coming up here. No. No. Go get your toy. You want to fight? Go get your toy. Go get it. Go get your toy. It's right there. I'm not interacting with you like this. Ooh. God. Speaking of queens, my fucking cat, dude. I mean, I definitely had those experiences as a little girl with, and an adult. And my whole life, forever and ever, amen. Ugh. Okay. Femmes, as part of the femme role, carry on this policing behavior in dyke communities to varying degrees, punishing butches and pressuring us overtly or covertly to become feminine. Asking why butches are butch is the same as asking why lesbians are lesbians. The question treats the butch as an alien, incomprehensible being in a sideshow, to be psychologically analyzed. It's like lesbians' families asking, "What did we do wrong to make you that way?" As if they deserve the credit for our turning out so wonderfully. It's insulting, oppressive, and patronizing for anyone to say They know what caused us to be, what patriarchy considers bad or wrong about us. It's the old standard, some terrible thing must have happened to cause that girl to become a sick queer. No. No. Damn. The theory that we're shaped only by forces outside ourselves denies that we have power to make decisions and be responsible for our own actions. Asking what caused butches comes from the attitude that butches are abnormal and femmes are normal. For instance, some femmes become obsessed with thoughts of male hormones when they see a butch with facial hair, and forget that just as many femmes have beards, not to mention all the het women who've had electrolysis. Why don't those femmes make the mistake of thinking of male hormones when they see very thin femmes with small breasts? It's because lack of female fat is admired by men, and female facial hair isn't. The only approach that makes sense is to start from the conviction that lesbianism is every female's natural inborn state, and that there are relentless attempts to condition it out of us by the greatest propaganda machine in existence, the institution of heterosexuality. We should instead ask, why do most females become het? It then becomes obvious that lesbianism involves not only love for females, but also resistance to and rebellion against heterosexual indoctrination. Heterosexuality is a vast and complex institution, and heterosexual conditioning has many facets. In order to become a successful, real woman, a girl must reject other girls and become feminine, het, wife, and a mother. The latter two preferably, but not necessarily together. At some time in their lives, most lesbians choose one or more of those roles. Many were wives, and some are mothers. Some chose to be het, but resisted marriage and motherhood. Some were never het, but did accept femininity enough to fit in as normal. There's certainly tremendous pressure to be feminine, but the fact that some lesbians totally resist it makes it clear that it is a choice, in the same way that being het's a choice. If het women didn't cooperate with the teaching to be het, all females would be lesbians. Similarly, if no lesbian accepted the teaching to be feminine, we'd all be butch. Butches, like femmes, live in patriarchy. We're not saying butch is our natural state, but that it's much closer to our inborn natural state, and that only a minority of little girls refuse men's demands to let go of that female essence. We can't know what we'd be like if we lived in a dyke-only world, but in the absence of het conditioning, there would be no such thing as femininity, and we'd all be more similar to how butches are now. Although most femmes we've talked with say they don't remember choosing the feminine role in girlhood, most butches clearly remember rejecting femininity and being punished for it as early as 2 years old. We're not trying to blame little femme girls for making bad decisions. After all, we had no political support and couldn't know the full meaning of our choices. We're saying that femmes must stop scapegoating dykes who refuse the easier path of normality and who've been viciously punished for that. We're saying that ex-het dykes, both femme and butch, must now act responsibly about the consequences our choices have meant for never het dykes. And femmes must face the consequences our choices have meant for butches. Ex-hets and femmes shouldn't wallow in guilt or self-recrimination. We should change our politics and truly support never het dykes and butches who've been forced to pay for the acceptance we bought. The lie that rape causes roles. Lesbians who were raped when they were girls become butch. Lesbians who were raped when they were girls become femme. We've heard each of these contradictory theories from lesbians who were trying to explain roles in the same way that lesbianism is often explained by psychiatrists. The first lie reinforces the stereotype that it takes something horrible to create a butch. It's difficult to disprove, since most butches are victims of family rape and other assaults. The fact that most femmes also are victims makes the second lie sound plausible, But that's also offensive because it implies that femness is created by oppression and butchness is created by having more privilege. The fact is that both butches and femmes are attacked as little girls, as are most het women. To focus on one denies the experiences of the other and obscures the reality that most girls are sexually assaulted. Passing as het. We have a responsibility to not pass for het, especially in places where hets are more liberal about queers. It's privileged arrogance to throw away the chance to help build dyke community by being out. Many lesbians manage to look acceptable enough to men and het women to get jobs, yet are still recognizable as dykes to the dykes who see them at work. There are other choices that make it possible to keep a job besides looking like a drag queen. The lesbians who go out of their way to look het get benefits from men and het women that are won at the cost of oppressing dykes who are less willing or less able to pass. Meanwhile, femme queens and het women eagerly dress up like drag queens. Old sexist dress codes are reinstated, and both femmes and butches who can't or won't pass are unable to get or keep jobs. And yes, there are a few butches who do try to pass as feminine for jobs, but they don't really convince anyone. Lesbians who choose to pass as het sometimes act insulted and falsely claim to be oppressed if other lesbians don't recognize them as lesbians. But it's not safe for us to make that assumption about them. Lesbians exist in every culture in the world, and we find each other by looking definably different from het standards. Those of us who are clearly out are more likely to be disowned by family and het friends, evicted, fired from jobs, arrested by police, beaten, raped, or be killed for being lesbians. We face huge risks, but to be closeted feels like a form of suicide to us. If every lesbian refused to pass as het, our tremendous numbers would make the world safer for us. And those dykes who can't pass, no matter how hard they try, would be in less danger. It's no coincidence that in every country we have information about, whatever the traditional local style, the look that's forbidden to females is the same look that's widely recognized as lesbian. This is the appearance that's reserved only for men, and is considered cross-dressing for females. One of the most common identifying characteristics for being recognizable lesbian is to have short, natural, neither permanented nor straightened, dyed, nor bleached hair. No. What did I say? I know you're up to no good. Go play with your toy. We're not playing right now. Damn. We mean the type of hair that even oblivious hets identify as lesbian, not crew cuts. It's lesbian baiting to act like being out means you have to adopt a ludicrous male military appearance. Critics of short hair accuse us of focusing on trivial issues. Yet their outrage makes it clear that hairstyle is anything but trivial to them. Okay, no. Hey, baby. Do you not like being ignored? Oh no. Oh no. You don't like to be ignored. I know you. I'm sorry. I will be off soon. There. And my kitty friend. You my kitty friend? I tried reading with you on my lap, but it disturbed you too much. Oh. Oh. Why are you the best? Why are you the best? Oh no. There he goes. No. Ugh. Go get your toy. No. You're not jumping up here. You're not doing any of your business. Go. Go play, Tito. Go play. Come on. Come on. I'm glad that YouTube humor finds this so funny. I mean, cats, right? Like, they just, especially mine. He wants to hang out with me. He wants to chew on me. You know, he wants me to throw his toy. And he wants what he wants, you know, and I get it. I get it. He's used to me not being here all day, so I think I'm like stimulating him mentally a lot too, and all the noise and such is difficult for him. How are other people's pets coping with like the quarantining that's going on? Like, are your cats like angry at you more? They're like, hey, shut the fuck up, human. Because mine, mine definitely is even more so than usual. And as you all know, I have a very, opinionated, very demanding feline companion. So, okay. Femininity pressures women to be obsessed with their appearance in time-consuming and self-hating ways. Racist attitudes pressure racially and ethnically oppressed females with tightly curled hair to have their hair straightened, or at least made more loosely curled with burning corrosive chemicals. And although the oppression is far less, females with more acceptably straight hair are sometimes expected, depending on current styles, to make their hair curly in order to be more feminine. Very few females have escaped having their hair drastically altered when they were little girls, so that they could quote-unquote look their best. And most have... Oh no. I'm here. Alright. I know, I'm his world. Radical by Choice says, you're his person and he loves you. I mean, yeah, I'm his world. I am his person and I love him back. He's my kitty. It's a very important relationship. Are you jealous? Do you get jealous? I think you do. I think cats are very jealous creatures. I think they're very jealous. I think you're a jealous kitty. Are you jealous? You get jealous. It's okay. We all get jealous. I love you. I love you, even though we fight. I don't want you stepping on my computer. I don't like that. It makes me nervous. It makes me feel like, oh no. Yeah. It makes me think, oh no. Do you understand? No. Oh no. What? Ooh. No. Come on. No. No, baby. Come on. Stop. Ugh. Right. Where was I? And most have chosen, as adults, to alter their hair. There are fashions which have been called lesbian or even separatist when they're just another counterculture kind of femininity. One of these is the tail, or fag tag, with the hair worn short in the front and long in the back. Either way, all across or with just a narrow section hanging down. This fashion is popular among gay men who originated it, punks, and now mainstream het men and women. It's become so trendy that even young boys in nuclear families wear it. The lesbian who has it may think she's being blatantly out, but the style says, I may be a lesbian, but then again, I may be het or bisexual. Either way, I don't want anyone to get the impression I'm a dyke. Even the smallest tail or smallest earring, or several earrings in a row up the ear, says I'm feminine. It's a symbol of rebellion against male directives for lesbians to refuse to change the natural appearance of our hair and to refuse to grow it long, preventing men from easily grabbing it. It's also a symbol of ethnic and racial pride for lesbians to refuse to straighten their hair in imitation of Northwestern European hair types. Some racially and ethnically oppressed lesbians wear their hair in styles that reflect their racial and ethnic heritage. No, no, no. No, no, no. Where was I? But still make it possible for themselves to be recognized as dykes. They do this by wearing styles of hair and clothing that aren't specifically feminine. Other lesbians, however, have used their ethnic identification as an excuse to dress and wear their hair in ways that give them privilege of being closeted. Meanwhile, the out lesbians from their same ethnic background risk serious retribution and attack because they dress in ways that are allowed only to males of their cultures. PC and PI. Politics that support femininity either assert that feminist is an oppression, which makes it difficult for politically responsible dykes to argue against it, or they assert that femininity is simply a matter of personal taste and preference, which implies that anyone objecting to it would have to be a dictatorial powermonger. No dyke has the power to stop others from selling out. As the oppressed, all we can do is object. Heterosexist lesbians aren't usually content with being oppressive. They like to post that they're PI, politically incorrect. That way they can pretend they're original, brave, and revolutionary, instead of passively conforming to male rule. Lesbians who admire and follow such male-defined politics as femininity, quote-unquote lesbian porn, sadomasochism, passing as het, supporting lesbian pregnancy, or protecting boys' and men's rights to be in lesbian space, often pride themselves on being politically incorrect. Those who protest the selling out are considered boring bullies. After all, it's easiest to silence someone by turning them into a joke. Interestingly, these are the exact same tactics that European descent men and het women use to ridicule anyone who protests the status quo. Whether by fighting racism or objecting to people wearing fur coats made from the bodies of endangered species. The few truly brave dykes who are fighting the patriarchal onslaught against our communities are treated as if we were in power, even though encouraging and supporting our dyke looks and behavior is far less common in our communities than criticism of out dykes. This is a typical male mindfuck. It's the lesbians who are following men's directives who are politically correct in a male-run world. And they derive privilege from that correct role. It's as if they came into radical dyke communities wearing crosses and other right-wing symbols saying, "We're so brave to stand up to you all." There's nothing courageous in wearing the feminine uniform, whether the old conservative or the newer punk styles, repeating the ancient heterosexist propaganda and doing just what women are supposed to do in patriarchy. These anti-political politics aren't just anti-lesbian. They're usually oppressive in every other way as well. As this excerpt from a lesbian personal ad shows, politically incorrect and proud of it. 5'4", 135 pounds, green eyes, platinum blonde hair, good-looking, very intelligent. Dislike, stereotypical dykes, man-haters. Seeks woman who is Caucasian, pale-skinned, slender, 25 to 30 plus, physically fit, pretty. Okay, if you wear a pound of mascara, the more exotic you are, the better. Who's calling who male? Looking like a dyke does not mean we're trying to look like men. Dykes who aren't trying to gain privilege by looking het are often mistaken for men or boys because we don't look like men's definition of women. Even femmes are occasionally called sir by hets if they're wearing dyke clothes, short hair, no makeup, no earrings, etc. Yet it's butches who are accused by femmes of trying to be men. Femmes, as well as butches, have sometimes tried to pass as men when traveling or walking alone at night because it was far more dangerous not to. This is just common sense, and lesbians often approve a femme doing it, but not a butch. Why the double standard? Something unfair is going on when there's one standard for butches and another for femmes. Feminists admire females who take traditional male jobs, especially professional careers, and don't accuse them of wanting to be men. Butches are clearly visibly dykes. We're sometimes mistaken for men not because we want to be men, but because no one believes females should be so solidly, sturdily ourselves in the way men are allowed to be. It's ironic that many lesbians who accuse butches of being like men. Ooh! You better not try to attack my plant. There's this plant I have in the window that sometimes when we're quarreling, oh yeah, he's going after it. Do not eat my plant. Do not eat my plant. Ooh. Oh, my cat. My lovely cat. It's ironic that many lesbians who accuse butches of being like men actually like some men. They just don't think females have the right to be any of the positive ways patriarchy reserves for the male image. Being taken for a man is deeply insulting and queerbaiting. It doesn't mean that the dyke is getting any male privileges or power. Butches live under female oppression as well as the worst of lesbian oppression. If femmes defend themselves against the lesbians or men attack by explaining that it's one of the many anti-lesbian stereotypes, why can't they defend butches in the same way? Why can't femmes understand that butches get more of this treatment because butches have always been the most obvious lesbians? Many femmes, particularly never het and other dyke-identified femmes, are treated as more queer by queenier femmes. Even the queeniest femmes know what it's like to be treated as a pervert by het women. That gives them a taste of butch oppression. Any femme who says she doesn't understand at all what it's like to be butch reveals how much het privilege she has and how much she considers butches as other, alien, and beneath her. Butches are not like men. Butches don't think, look, or act like men. Butches don't have the privilege and power of men. In terms of the heterosexist hierarchy, we're the least privileged of all lesbians. Men, het women, and femme lesbians never treat butches as if we actually were men, because that would mean giving us privilege. When they call butches male, they're being extremely cruel, smug, arrogant, dishonest, and oppressive. The lesbian hating of this stereotype is outrageous. Most femmes take part in this mass community of butches, which has disastrous consequences, causing butches emotional pain, deprivation, isolation, fear, and illness. Butches are treated as the queerest of the queers. In the patriarchal hierarchy, men are at the top, next to wives, mothers, single het women, then celibate het women. Next are femme queens who emulate and identify with men and het women. Next are dyke-identified femmes. And finally, butches are at the bottom. As we said in Chapter 3, this hierarchy is also affected by how long we've been lesbians, when we came out, and past het privilege. Also, we're in no way minimizing the significance of racial, ethnic, class, nationality, physical ability, fat, looks, and age oppression. Butches who are oppressed in any and all of these ways are additionally oppressed if we're also butch. Just as among lesbians, the normal lesbian image is a middle-class stereotype, the queer butch image is often classist. When butches are said to be like men, the image presented certainly isn't that of the male lawyer, doctor, or business executive. It's more likely to be the stereotype of a working-class mechanic who hangs out in bars, is uneducated, uncultured, rude, tough, cold, and violent. These aren't just anti-butch and anti-lesbian lies, but classist lies as well. Meanwhile, the model for femininity is based on upper-class WASP het woman ideal. A few butches may appear to have a fractional share of something that's usually reserved for men, such as a non-traditional job. But the vast majority of females who've moved into such high-paying work are het. A few are femme lesbians. The very few butches in those jobs are much more oppressed on the job, just as we are everywhere else. The only females who seem to have attained executive upper-class positions as the heads of companies and high status in governments, often by being daughters or wives of powerful men, are again het women. Butches who've tried to pass as men or who are taken to be men or who've done any or all of the things used to prove butches are male identified don't prove anything except that in patriarchy, if you don't accept the role of womanly, you're labeled manly, whether you like it or not. Parents, relatives, teachers, and other girls who treat a butch girl as a boy aren't causing her to be butch. Her resistance to femininity was chosen by her much earlier in life. What they're doing is abusing her by refusing to acknowledge her as a female. She's not given the real privilege a boy has. She's just treated as less than real girl. In what way is a butch girl thinking she's not a woman different from adult dyke separatists and radical lesbians rejecting the term woman for ourselves as a political act? Except that choosing to reject a misdefinition is easier when you've had a chance to acquire a clear analysis and political support. Can't the young butch's early rejection of femininity be seen as an intuitive awareness that feminine usually means heterosexual, and all the other disgusting things that go with it? Isn't she instinctively realizing much earlier and without political support that all the outward symbols of womanliness and heterosexuality and the internalized values that support them also mean fuckable, dependent, unthinking, or submissive, and ultimately passive? Young dykes who perceive that crap for what it is and rebel against it without support and in spite of constant punishment are to be admired and respected. That's courage. Because some butches have bound down their breasts, butches are called male. In a world where men and boys stare and grab at females' breasts on the street, making humiliating comments, it's not so odd that a dyke would want to conceal and protect her body. Isn't it more questionable to wear padded push-up bras in order to elicit sexual attention from men? Who but the truly male-identified would wear an apparatus that pushes her breast out and up into men's faces, ruin her back, pelvis, and feet by tottering around on high heels, squash her body into a girdle, painfully remove the fur on her body or face, wear makeup that looks like bruises across her cheeks, or that mimics sexual excitement, poison herself and anyone within breathing distance with chemicals that disguise her female aroma, or wear a dress that exposes her body and makes her less able to escape from rape? Who else would deliberately starve and torture, quote-unquote exercise herself to look weak, powerless, unfemale, and thin enough to please men? And who else would believe that looking so undignified and ludicrous is being fashionably beautiful? One femme we know was on a local Oakland, California television show about butch and femme roles. Even though lesbians had in the past spent many hours explaining to her much of what we were saying in this chapter, she wore het paraphernalia and makeup and explained that she was a femme because, quote-unquote, I feel like a girl. Bev. Using makeup does males dirty work in other ways, too. Where do lesbians think cosmetic chemicals come from? Besides the fact that most cosmetics are proven to be safe by torturing and murdering millions of animals, Lesbians don't usually consider what it's like to work or live near cosmetics factories. I have a higher risk of developing cancer or liver disease because of growing up half a block from such a factory. My working class neighborhood was daily subjected to the nauseating caustic fumes that literally blistered the paint off cars. It's no coincidence that factories are built only in poor and working class areas. Studies have shown that in the US, 884 ingredients used in cosmetics have been reported to the government as toxic substances. Of these, 314 are reported to cause biological mutation, 218 to cause reproductive complications, 778 are capable of acute toxicity, 146 are reported to cause tumors, and 376 ingredients cause skin and eye irritations. But the U.S. cosmetics industry is a $17 billion business. It's far surpassing that now. So, there are no inhalation tests to determine perfume safety, only skin tests, and neurotoxic effects are not examined. Because of lesbians choosing to use these poisons, many ill lesbians can't go to lesbian events or even visit lesbians in their homes. The lie that butches bond with men. This is a particularly offensive stereotype considering that men are butches' enemies. Many of the butches we've known haven't ever been friends with men, while many of the femmes we've known have. Why are the few butches who are friends with men focused on, when it's het women as a group who literally physically bond with men? What of their collaboration? Het women are intimate with men in ways that no lesbian could ever be. They welcome men into their bodies, create and nurture men. Some even collaborate with males in the beating, rape, and murder of other females. If any lesbians bond with men, it's more likely to be ex-het femmes than butches. Many ex-het femmes maintain close relationships with ex-husbands and ex-boyfriends. Ex-het femmes are also more likely to become bisexual or return to being het. Of the many lesbians we've known who've gone het, all were femmes, and most had been het. Men and hets are more comfortable with femmes than with butches, because that's how they want us to be. The more femme and het identified a lesbian is, the more comfortable patriarchy is. Butches as sexual objects. One of the major stereotypes of butches is that we objectify femmes. This again compares butches to men, when the reality is that it's usually femmes who sexually objectify butches. Butches are more likely to take the risk of initiating being lovers than femmes are, which is courageously lesbian. When femmes appear to be more aggressive, they're often, in fact, trying to get the butches to do the initiating. A femme at a lesbian forum said about coming out, "You don't go with men after you grow up thinking you would, then you let a woman touch you, and that's really scary." What goes on in a lesbian's mind when rather than talk about coming out through the desire to love and touch another female, her focus is on letting a lesbian touch her. This is a common attitude. The femme is the one who is loved, and the butch is the one who loves. The way some femmes come on at all butches and ignore other femmes sexually is similar to the way many het women flirt with all men and ignore other females. It's also similar to the way men objectify females, viewing them only as things to be used for sexual conquest. It's personally and sexually invasive to assume butches welcome this impersonal and inappropriate attention. One butch we knew was approached at a party by a femme who'd recently come out. They worked together and there'd been no sexual interaction between them. Our friend thought of this lesbian as just an acquaintance. Suddenly the femme said, "Put your hand on my breast." The butch was stunned. She had no interest in touching this lesbian in any way. She felt verbally molested, but presumably was supposed to feel flattered. Another dyke we know was in a bar when a femme she barely knew and wasn't even in conversation with deliberately rubbed her bare breast across our friend's arm. When a butch and femme become lovers, the butch is more likely to make love to the femme than vice versa. Some femmes never reciprocate their lover's passionate attentions. Many do, but often not with the same intensity and focus that they enjoy from their lover. Is it any wonder that some butches become reluctant to accept lovemaking from femme lovers when all have experienced rejection, indifference, and half-hearted going through the motions? It also doesn't help that many femmes are attracted by the stereotype of the quote-unquote stone butch, without any awareness that femmes have created and maintained that stereotype for their own benefit, and that it causes a great deal of pain to butches. Many femmes want to believe that butches get something out of inequality in lovemaking. Some femmes even insist. Some water. Some femmes even insist that a butch doesn't need to be made love to because the femme's orgasm mysteriously causes her butch lover to have an orgasm at the same time. Riley referred to by an old Butch Dyke friend as the phantom orgasm. Again, femmes are perceiving butches to be some kind of man. After all, don't men prefer to be the active partner in sexual encounters with women? Doesn't it give them power over women? But butches are not men. In Aotearoa, Dykes sarcastically referred to femmes who don't make love to their lovers as flat on their back fairies. Fairy is an old Dyke word from Aotearoa for femme. Femininity teaches women to imagine themselves the center of sexual attention, the alluring flower meant to attract rewards from excited, attentive, and loving admirers. Of course, that's het fairy tale crap. The het woman's ruffles and perfumes are meant to attract men, and men's attentions are far from loving. Most femmes don't want to attract men, but they have internalized that image of themselves as an alluring center of sexual attention, and they simply substitute butches as those they want to attract. But butches are not men. We're females. We're lesbians. And our lovemaking has absolutely no connection or resemblance to men fucking women. A butch focuses her attention on her lover's pleasure, and her lovemaking is a way of creating strong emotional and psychic intimacy with her lover. Men don't make love. They use women's bodies to masturbate themselves and to establish dominance over them. They fuck women. The physical realities of the two activities are completely different. Considering the profound emotional and psychic differences as well, comparing butches to men in intimate sensual relationships is glaringly illogical and insulting. It would be more accurate to say that, in many cases, a butch making love with a femme is similar to a lesbian making love with a het woman. The most het-identified femme's lovemaking is like a man's. Her focus is on her pleasure alone, with no concern for her lovers. When she does touch her lover, it's with the intention of fucking her and dominating her. It is the most insensitive, harsh kind of lesbian lovemaking. The butch is set up as the queer, and her female needs and desires, physical, mental, emotional, and beyond, are ignored because she's not perceived as being female. Does this sound like a safe situation for a butch to say, I really want you to make love to me the way I make love to you, even though a lifetime of queer and butch oppression would make it hard for me to believe you really meant it? Not likely. Some femmes are pushed into unequal lovemaking by lovers who are more femme. These femmes experience some of the pain, frustration, humiliation, loneliness, and self-hatred that unreciprocated passion creates, and they can understand from that what butches go through all of the time. Passive femmes avoid their own queerness. By being lovers only with butches or pushing femme lovers into an oppressed butch role, a femme can avoid her fear of her own lesbianism. When a lesbian initiates making love to her lover, she directly faces the fact that she's a lesbian. But if she's made love to and doesn't reciprocate that love, then she can feel less queer. In fact, by being passive in lesbian intimacy, she is less queer. That makes her lover the real queer. This is especially true of butches, but also affects femmes in the butch role. The common het stereotype of lesbian couples is that one is the real lesbian, the butch, and one is a het woman who's been forced or seduced into the relationship by the butch. This oppresses butches, not femmes. Femmes who are involved with butches and do nothing to fight the oppression of butches go along with that stereotype, whether they mean to or not. When they go out into the het world with their lover, they're not thought of as being responsible for the relationship. They're perceived as het and temporarily involved with a lesbian instead of with a man. As insulting as this is to the femme, it's far more insulting and dangerous to the butch. This unequal situation can be avoided only if the femme takes equal responsibility for being a lesbian and for being in a lover relationship, which means acting and looking like a dyke. I'm going to take a second. My throat is irritated. What do you all think? I mean, I'm like reading this. I haven't read it in a couple years, so it's kind of interesting to me to revisit it. And as you see, the light has come out more. There's more sunlight here, so. Okay. Think about how het women flirt with us, act scared of us, believe and spread lesbian hating lies about us, patronize us, treat us like perverts, or as if we're arrested in a childish state. That's how many femmes treat butches. Some ex-het femmes have said that it took them a long time to come out because they met butches and were terrified, so they went back to men. Now, that's really taking responsibility for yourself. Weren't they scared of men? Why not? While many femmes are passive because of irresponsibility, some have much more destructive motives. Some femmes who lived with or married men when they were het actually want their lover to be in a male role. They may push their lover to act like the ex-husband, boyfriend, to make love in a way that feels like fucking because they haven't stopped thinking like men's women. Since butches have much less social power than femmes, particularly ex-het femmes, they're vulnerable to being pushed around by them, including being forced into the femmes' fantasies. Especially since part of the femme role is authoritativeness towards butches. For example, it's usually male-identified ex-het femmes who talk about liking to be fucked hard and who like their butch lover to use a dildo. An old dyke friend recalls with pain and anger being made to feel like a walking dildo. She tells of the countless times such femmes have said to her, "I'm a lesbian at heart, but my body is still heterosexual and wants a prick." When a butch is told all her life that she's not really a woman and is taught to hate herself, is it surprising that she would take a real woman's word for what women like in lovemaking? Some of the ways butches are stereotyped come not from the ways butches look or act, but from fantasies, desires, and pressures of het-identified lesbians. These are the ex-het femmes who, when they talk about past lovers, include men. These are the lesbians who came out for reasons other than their love of females. They just happen to fall in love with a woman this time, or they want power over others that they can't get with men, or they want to play out male pornographic fantasy. Most lesbians we've known who like to read porn have been femmes. By never making love to their lover, by only being made love to, femmes like this can fantasize they're really with a man. Then they turn around and accuse their lover of being male-identified. It's horrible that lesbians like these, who operate totally out of male and het values and fuck over lesbians, are accepted as nice, role-free lesbians, while butches, and to a lesser extent dyke-identified femmes, are persecuted for their lesbianism by other lesbians. Femmes sometimes ask, usually with hostility, well, why are most butches lovers with femmes then? And how come lots of butches admire feminine lesbians? The answer is internalized oppression. It's not unusual for other kinds of oppressed lesbians to admire and consistently become lovers with lesbians from more privileged groups. For instance, some working class lesbians are lovers only with class privileged lesbians. Resistance to femininity comes at a high price, a total lack of support, which breeds self-doubt and self-hatred. In that situation, the more privileged and acceptable are always more highly valued than those who remind you of yourself, and you gain a little protection from oppression by getting their friendship and approval. Also, butches are in a minority, so we meet more femmes. Some butches do succeed in becoming lovers with each other, and those we've met have said that theirs was the most equal relationship they'd experienced, and that they'd been able to help each other nurture self-love. Who's sex-obsessed? Queens are often remarkably callous towards butches and dyke-identified femmes. Many dykes have experienced queens' het-style sexual games, but they can be very difficult to confront. Queens' sexually suggestive comments and jokes can seem like harmless play. A queen commenting on the vulval appearance of food or flowers may seem charming, while a butch saying the same words is likely to be called sex-obsessed. Any dyke who directly asks a queen if she's flirting is also likely to be called sex-obsessed. Meanwhile, the queen gains popularity through manipulation, pretending attraction to dykes she's not interested in. She may accidentally rub her breast in public or pubic region against a dyke, or place her knee between the legs of a dyke while dancing, her manner clearly flirtatious. The dyke may feel vulnerable and confused, wondering, am I imagining this? Does this mean she's attracted to me? If I respond with interest, will she deny what she's doing? The queen will very likely respond with surprise, feign fear, ridicule, or anger. This type of covert sexual manipulation borders on molestation in the sense that being an uninvited invasion of physical boundaries that's done in order to gain a power position. It's especially harmful to family rape victims or any dyke who's ever had her reality repeatedly denied. Yet this intrusive femme seductiveness is admired by many lesbians and falsely thought of as sexual honesty and being daringly out when it's nothing more than the way liberated het women act with men. Lesbian sexuality should be genuine, dyke-loving, and egalitarian. Queens often set up competition by flirting with several dykes at the same time and then enjoy being fought over. They may also maintain power by stringing along several lovers at once without giving any their full attention, acceptance, or intimacy, and then harassing their hapless followers for their reasonable jealousy. The lie that butches are tough, closed, mean, violent, and emotional. Every lesbian has to be tough to survive. We're threatened and attacked verbally and physically because we're dykes. The more out we are, the more likely we are to be attacked, especially physically. Even when we're not being overtly attacked, we're stared at, made to feel like outcasts, and are the objects of angry, disgusted, hating, patronizing, leering, or ridiculing looks. Even if no male or het woman is being horrible at a particular moment, we're still constantly assaulted by a het pornographic male world, with male fantasies of females in store windows, on billboards, and in all the male and het media. A dyke can't be all fluffy and sweet with a soft open face when she's walking through a virtual minefield. Femmes also have to protect ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally, and psychically against this assaultive het world, although to a lesser extent, and as a result, could be accused of being mean, closed, and tough. When butches are similarly self-protective, our behavior is used to prove male lies about butches being hard. Yet the het world is much more hostile and dangerous to butches, especially those who are further oppressed by racism, anti-Semitism, ethnicism, classism, ableism, fat oppression, lookism, and ageism. It's a basic political principle that it's not all right for those with more power to name and define those with less power. A femme who accuses a butch of being suspicious, for instance, should ask herself instead, what is it is in her own behavior that the butch has reason not to trust. There's plenty. If the femme is doing nothing to fight butch oppression and making the usual assumption that it's the butch with the problem, treating someone as abnormal is an excellent reason not to be trusted. Femmes treat butches this way all the time, with very rare exceptions. Butches have more than enough reason to relate to the general world with great distrust, and we also have plenty of reason to not trust femmes the way things are at present in lesbian communities. While butches are frequently and publicly insulted in lesbian publications and elsewhere, with almost no one speaking out in our defense, we would be most unwise to completely trust femmes. Butches are told we're unemotional, tough, and cold, because we're not femmes. These accusations have very little to do with what each individual butch is actually like. Femmes, being feminine, are perceived as soft, vulnerable, and emotionally expressive, which is often far from the truth. Femmes aren't oppressed by this womanly stereotype. They've chosen to live it because of the privilege it gives for appearing to be normal women. In reality, femmes are more often tough, closed, mean, and less genuinely emotional than butches are. It's tough, mean, and closed to act oppressively to butches. Queens who won't even try to be close to other femmes and try to make butches feel all their needs are especially emotionally distant. Femmes who'll only be close to lovers or lesbians they're attracted to are impossible to be friends with. Queens sometimes behave in stereotypical feminine ways by throwing scenes, screaming, using tears to manipulate others, and generally acting like drama queens. This doesn't prove that femmes are open and butches are closed. Throwing scenes isn't real emotion. It's pushing other lesbians around, intimidating and silencing them by using theatrical power plays or cruel outbursts that show no consideration for other lesbians' feelings. These displays are learned behavior deliberately used for effect. It's not from being genuinely upset, which all of us feel sometimes and need to express. Many femmes learned this behavior from their mothers and use it to get their own way instead of resolving conflicts responsibly and fairly. The same femmes who use tears to manipulate other lesbians are likely to ignore or ridicule a butch who cries. That is the more male behavior. None of the butches we've met conform to the tough, closed stereotype. Butches are often more there, warmer, and more emotionally supportive than many femmes. We've met as much or more genuine warmth, sensitivity, and willingness to deal honestly with feelings among butches as among femmes. Butch's solid dyke identity gives a personal realness that no amount of femininity will ever confer. To be more lesbian is to be more true to our natural female selves, while to be less lesbian identified, more het identified, is to be further from our real selves. The further you are from your real self, the less capable you are of being honestly direct, and the less capable you are of being really close to another lesbian. Portraying an entire group of lesbians as all having the same characteristics is objectifying and denies individual personalities and differences. Just as there are many sorts of dykes, there are many sorts of butches. As long as femmes are projecting stereotypes onto butches, femmes will never be able to truly communicate and be close to us. This is the femmes failing, not the butches. It is also the femmes' loss and the butches' oppression. There's also a stereotype of butches being drunks, which reflects the common stereotypes of lesbians as alcoholics. In our experience, recovering alcoholic butches are more likely to be open about being alcoholic and having stopped drinking than femmes. This makes alcoholic butches more visible than alcoholic femmes, of whom there are many. This stereotype is also used against many other oppressed groups, since using alcohol and drugs is a common way of trying to cope with oppression. Unfortunately, being bombarded with hatred causes self-hatred. Many lesbians end up believing lesbian-hating lies. They may think they're queer because of emotional or hormonal problems. Some butches believe the same. A few may even agree with butch-hating lies, but no one should use butches' internalized oppression to believe the lies. No dyke should be repeating those lies any more than they should repeat stereotypical lies about any other oppressed group. But some butches are like men is like saying, but some working class lesbians are dirty, lazy, stupid slobs. Just because someone says something derogatory about themselves or about someone else doesn't mean it's true. Butch oppression hurts all dykes. No matter how often the stereotypes of butches in particular and lesbians in general are proven to be untrue, the lies are still spread and damage is still done. Why? Because lesbians are the only threat to the worldwide rule of patriarchy, and butches are the most obvious of lesbians. The dykes who most clearly refuse to cooperate with male domination of the world. Why do lesbians themselves participate in the male assaults on our resistance struggle? One of the reasons is that patriarchy is based on hierarchy and inequality, divide and conquer. Females are split up into many different groups and taught to be antagonistic, ridiculing, and hating towards anyone who's apart from the crowd. We learn this as little girls in our schools, families, and religions. Part of the conditioning is to become real women. To become real women is being taught to police and bully other girls on behalf of the male power structure. That's why even young girls can be so cruel to anyone who is different. Why is it that het women who exemplify feminine deluxe are perceived as emotional, loving, open, soft, and expressive? It's because they get close to, are open to, and love males. They sure as hell aren't that way with lesbians. The feminine stereotype is a lie. Het women are closed emotionally because they won't be intimately open with other females. Lesbians, especially butches, are falsely stereotyped as closed because lesbians are not available for intimacy with men. No matter how intimate and warm we are with each other, we're still called distant, closed, emotionally frozen, because closeness between lesbians doesn't count. Only loving men and boys, especially sons, is counted as feelings. I know, it's so real. Individual hets can be as cold and vicious as they like, but as long as they're a wife and mother, they qualify as gentle, warm, feeling, womanly. Non-separatist lesbians, though they don't hate women, or don't hate and avoid men like separatists do, still don't fuck with men. That's basic to lesbian identity. No matter how nice non-separatists are to men, they're still viewed by men and het women as the mean, hard lesbians of the stereotypes. Even more so separatists, who are so quote-unquote cruel and harsh as to have the guts to perceive men as the rapists and murderers they are. We supposedly quote-unquote lack compassion and are quote-unquote hard and vicious because we hate males, while rapists and murderers are the objects of universal womanly admiration, loyalty, and love. Het women breed, feed, clothe, clean for, fuck, love, and support those rapists, and so are considered loving, natural, open, and womanly, instead of being accurately perceived as the lesbian-hating, female-hating collaborators they really are. Meanwhile, lesbians who dare to challenge het women's hatred towards us are called women-hating, the tired lie of reverse discrimination. The world we live in calls hatred and cruelty love. It calls courage and wit cruelty. Lesbians, especially butches, are set up by men to be the universal scapegoats for male crime. Understanding this makes it clear why we're stereotyped as harsh, cruel, and mean. Stereotypes should always be analyzed to find out who they profit. Then we find out why the stereotype exists. That's more important than picking apart every individual component of each stereotype. Once we grasp why it exists, the entire body of lies automatically loses credibility. So whenever a femme is tempted to treat a butch as the stereotype, she should realize that, whether she wants to or not, she's doing it on men's behalf. Hopefully that will make it clear to her that she must stop. If she refuses to stop oppressing butches because she doesn't want her own femme privilege to be threatened, she should realize that her actions are ultimately supporting men to go on abusing herself as a female and lesbian. Butches need to become more aware of femme privilege and butch oppression, not in a self-hating way, but by realizing how we're oppressed and by caring about the oppression of other butches. Part of that means developing solidarity with other butches and unlearning the lesbian hatred that leads to valuing femmes more. The old pattern of being attracted to and falling in love with manipulative, game-playing, attractive queens doesn't only hurt ourselves, it hurts other butches as well. It's essential to not fall for the thrill of femme flirtation that has no love or real caring behind it. That also means fighting the urge to be trusting and protective of femmes who are actually being oppressive to you or others. For some butches, that means changing a lifetime of believing that the most feminine lesbians are the most female identified. It means being true to yourself, own self, and to all dyke-identified dykes, butch and femme. Dyke-identified femme friends and lovers can be true and trusted allies to butches, as the authors of this book prove. Reacting with rage towards all femmes doesn't help to fight femme privilege. It can make things worse as well as being unfair. Dyke-identified femmes shouldn't get the brunt of a butch's lifetime of very understandable anger about butch oppression. Queens usually make sure they're not around to deal with any of it. It also doesn't help to insist your lover is butch when she really isn't. Both butches and femmes do this. Dyke-loving femmes can love and support our butch friends and lovers best by supporting and encouraging their resistance to butch oppression and by rejecting femininity. Lesbian-hating lesbians, those who haven't challenged their internalized anti-lesbian attitudes, are less able to be emotionally open and intimate with other lesbians because of the fear that lesbian hatred causes. Real intimacy with dyke friends and lovers requires deep acknowledgement, acceptance, and pride in our lesbianism. Dyke joy and intensity, love, as well as and well-being are our rewards. To remain lesbophobic is to leave in place barriers to intimacy that no amount of therapy or drugs can ever get rid of. Only lesbian-identified politics and really caring about other dykes, dyke separatism, will remove those barriers. So that is the chapter. I'm surprised I did it, but I read through the whole thing, even with the drama of my feline companion interrupting and my own throat kind of going off. It's a very intense piece. And it says a lot of things that I've not heard anywhere else. Which is part of why I think it is so important to read. Because I've never read any lesbian material that is that blatantly hostile to heterosexual values and just to heterosexuality itself. In a way that's also like not just critical but like self-loving as well. Oh my god. Chocolate is so good. So yeah, revisiting this subject. I honestly, like, reading some of it, I kind of had these little flashes of insight and remembrances about, like, just ways that I've been, like, closed off as a feminine lesbian and how that's impacted other dykes. So, I don't know, there's, like, it is a piece that's, like, hard to sometimes look at and dissect because it's just so full of those kind of like hard truths, as I said at the beginning, where you're like left to kind of sit with a lot of feelings that aren't good, and you have to like kind of oftentimes go through your experiences and kind of put things into perspective, or maybe like situations that you've been in from any angle and kind of analyze them in a different way with women. So I'm like, apart from like analyzing like myself being closed off, I'm also like analyzing the way that like some women have treated me as a dyke. And even though the funny thing is like, even though I know this stuff and even though I've like got an intellectual understanding of it, as it plays out in life and reality, it still impacts me. You know, I still have succumbed to getting caught up in this stuff. And I think it's a lot of it has to do with the fact that so many are, and like resisting a dominant culture, especially when you're like already at the margins, it's very difficult. So those are kind of my thoughts after reading it. I feel that this is a subject that is also hard to talk about because it's not simple. There's a lot of like context and things that we have to like go through and dissect and discuss before we can even get to talking about what these terms mean. And in my experience, you know, when you talk or say anything about femme privilege, like it often has like a backlash effect. I've also seen that with like mother privilege is the only thing that I would compare it to, really. But it's hard, you know, or if you do criticize these things and talk about them in terms of like collaboration and that kind of perspective, it alienates a lot of women because I think it's much easier for women to understand feminism from the angle of like victimhood than from like understanding it as a society that we're all creating day by day with our choices that we make. And yeah, I really appreciate them like taking the time to write this. I mean, to write this entire book is like a really incredible thing. But just to specifically name and talk about butch oppression, it's one of the, I don't think I've really come across anything else that really is this incisive in terms of actually talking about this phenomena, which is like so, to me, so blatant, but almost it's like the paradox of our culture. Sometimes things can be so blatant and obvious as to be invisible to us. And I think a lot of that comes into play when we talk about femininity as well, and like how it's oppressive to women. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to head out. I want to thank you all for listening and revisiting this subject matter with me a few years later. And hopefully some of the women who were visiting my old video about butch oppression and femme privilege will be here and like kind of get this full perspective, because it's a lot to analyze. And as I said, like even looking back at my video from a couple years ago, I feel like my awareness of this has like shifted completely. So I have to say that like knowing it intellectually versus like actually understanding it in our core is something that we have a lot of work to do on, and it's not even like scratching the surface, just hearing these words. We have to like see them in action too, unfortunately. But we can try, to be conscious and mindful and also courageous. And that's the thing I think that is hard to cultivate, is courage in women. And like we all have different things to be courageous about. I mean, I've met so many lesbians who've had like issues with lovers, for example. And, even though they can like sense what's going on, it's hard to name. It's so hard to name. It's so hard to like know what the phenomena is. Like you feel a certain way about it, or like a lot of the times, one example is like most dykes I've known have gone out of their way for a lover who would never reciprocate, be it sexually, be it financially, be it whatever, and we do this with the expectation, I think, a lot of the time that it would be reciprocated, and come to find out that that isn't the case. And, it also gets complicated if you like have been a femme in a relationship with a butch who was like oppressive in other ways. So there's a lot of the time, I think other forms of oppression can get scapegoated as like some sort of quote unquote mask of center privilege. Me too, Sophia. I've had that issue with most lovers of butch or femme being that way with me. So it's a hard thing to talk about too, because like, for one, it's very direct to say that like someone isn't reciprocating as a lover, or isn't reciprocating your passion or your like interest, or even time or anything, like, and you talk about it, and also it's kind of an embarrassing thing to talk about too, which I think it makes sense why, like, if that goes on for years, we can come to expect that we're never going to get that, or be like really fearful and closed off, because of those experiences. So yeah, I mean, that is like one of the most obvious, I think, forms of this oppression, and one of the most difficult to talk about too, because like it requires like a level of speaking about something that is socially considered as well not appropriate to talk about. And as they said in the writing as well, I don't remember which piece, but there was this bit about how a queen can talk about like something looking like a vulva, right? Or like making some sort of remark like that, or making a sexual comment. But if you're butch or like extra dykey, it's perceived totally differently. It's perceived like totally like you're sex obsessed. There's just a level to with which there's a perception of sexual knowledge, I guess, and sexual obsession that's projected onto butches specifically, that helps enable the dehumanization. And like, it's just so interesting because like the reality is like a total inverse of that. So yeah, anyway. Thank you for all being here, listening to this stream. I hope you got something good out of it. I hope that you've like develop some either awareness or come to some sort of realizations from it, and that you all use them in your own relationships in the future, because that's what it's all about. It's like having healthier relationships so that we can have healthier communities, so we can have a healthier world. And with that, I'm going to pop off. Bye.